know. So
I didn't know if there was some other inside thing I should be looking for.
no Easter eggs this time. Okay, please find your seats. We'll get started here shortly. Is the microphone on? Can you hear me? No, it's not on? Well, I'll wait until the microphone is on then. A little bit, yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon's topic is the Austrian theory of the business cycle, which it turns out that it's a quite timely topic because there's a lot of confusion among the powers that be about what exactly a recession is. And I'm sure this has nothing to do with who's in office or who's in power right now. It's purely an academic exercise. And so hopefully Miss Yellen is tuning in on the online viewing, and she'll learn something from this lecture. Coincidentally, somebody yesterday, a good friend, said that I looked like Matt Walsh. And so perhaps another title for today's lecture is, what is a recession? We'll clear it up. I usually put the recommended reading at the end, and I always run out of time. And since it's so important, I decided to bump it up to the beginning. So here's just a few. You can take a picture of this or find the slides online to see these. But these are just a few things that I would recommend that you read, sort of in order of beginner to advanced. But Meltdown by Tom Woods was really my first introduction to Austrian business cycle theory, and it's great. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the theory. I'm not going to be talking about historical episodes, except perhaps in passing. And so if you want a good example of how the theory is applied to historical examples of business cycles, then you could look at Meltdown or America's Great Depression by Rothbard. I maintain that the first couple chapters of America's Great Depression by Rothbard is still the best exposition of Austrian business cycle theory, so definitely check that out. There's also The Causes of the Economic Crisis, which is a collection of essays and talks by Ludwig von Mises, both before and after the big crisis that happened in the late 20s and 30s. And so he didn't run into Paul Krugman's problem of having to backtrack and being incorrect about what he said. Mises has writings before and writings after, and we can see that it tells a coherent story. There's also a great article by Joseph Salerno in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. It's called A Reformulation of Austrian Business Cycle Theory in Light of the Financial Crisis. And here he's responding to some misconceptions that he found in the literature, and actually some Austrian adjacent scholars they were considering the Austrian theory as a sectoral shift or like a hydraulic sort of mechanistic theory. And so in this article, Salerno sort of he restates what the theory says and provides a good definition of overconsumption and malinvestment, and explains how the theory does fit what we see in the data in response to those critics. There's also A Time and Money, which is available in the bookstore. It's by Roger Garrison. It's a great pedagogical exposition in which he's got graphs that line up. And in the past, I've had those in my talk, but I've tried to change things up a little bit, so I don't have them here. But you can find Roger Garrison's previous lectures and also that book to see the great graphs that he has, and wonderful PowerPoints as well with the nice sound effects. And then finally, at the bottom I have Ludwig von Mises, his theory of money and credit, in which he originally expounded the Austrian theory of the business cycle. And it's worth noting here that in this book, he is actually connecting some ideas that already existed about the problems that exist with fractional reserve banking and how panics can arise. And in this book, Mises shows how it's not just localized to the banking sector. It's not just something that's a trouble for finance and banks, but when interest rates are falsified, when they're pushed artificially low, it's something that applies to production in general. And so this is where we have the first telling of the Austrian business cycle story. So another interesting thing that we should point out here is that we're branching away from the unhampered market economy, or the theory of unhampered markets, and into hampered markets. So we've seen in the lectures so far this week that individuals on their own and individuals interacting in the market economy are able to economize. They're able to dedicate resources towards their highest valued use. We've seen lots of examples from Crusoe. So Crusoe is able to see the stuff that he has on his island by himself, and he's able to, with his own ideas and his own preferences, he's able to allocate those resources towards productive uses so that he can attain the different wants and needs that he has. And it's not really an intellectual problem. It is difficult for Crusoe to go about that because he's operating in isolation as opposed to in a division of labor. But intellectually, it's not difficult because it's his own preferences, it's his own ideas, it's his own know-how that's being used to arrange his environment in such a way to produce the things that he wants and needs. It's a little bit more difficult when we talk about a division of labor, because then we have, intellectually, there's an extra complication, and the complication is because it comes from the fact that we can't engage in interpersonal utility comparisons. So your subjective value is your subjective value, and mine is my own. So since these are all personal, there's no way for us to measure value in an objective way. We had this question, okay, so because of that, or since we have that, how do we allocate resources? Who gets to consume what? Who decides to produce what? And we've seen over the past day and a half, we've seen how we accomplish that in an unhampered market economy, namely through the use of market prices and profit and loss calculations. So economic calculation allows us to, through voluntary exchanges on the market, we know that goods are being used towards their highest valued use. So that's how we branch from the individual acting in isolation to society. And while there is that extra complication with the interpersonal utility comparisons, we've seen how there's a solution to that, just voluntary exchange, private property prices, and profit and loss. But the question is, what happens when something outside the market acts upon market actors? What happens when somebody forces somebody to do something else? So instead of having voluntary exchange, we have violent interactions, or we have something like a state prohibiting people from doing the things that they would do if they were unhampered, or if they didn't have that sort of influence. And so that's where the Austrian business cycle theory fits. And that's worth stressing because there are a lot of people who might say that business cycles just happen on the market on their own. So like capitalism is just prone to these inconsistencies, and so we have business cycles that just occur because of the instability of investment spending or animal spirits or all sorts of things that are built into the economy. But the Austrian theory says that no, there is no reason why we would expect that in an unhampered market economy. It only comes from outside the market. Only influences from outside the market would cause there to be the intertemporal discoordination that we see in the business cycle. So one example that I have, going back to Crusoe, is Crusoe has a certain stock of consumer goods that he's collected over time. He's saved up some of his resources. He hasn't consumed everything. And that allows him to engage in a prolonged period of production. If he has extra coconuts and berries and fish or whatever it is, if he has more of those things, then he can spend the day making a capital good. He can spend the week perhaps, depending on the size of his subsistence fund, depending on the amount of coconuts and berries that he has. He could dedicate some time to different lines of production that have payoffs in the future. He can make specific capital goods today as opposed to just going out and collecting coconuts and berries like he does in normal times. So this stock of saved resources allows him to engage in longer production projects, right? However, suppose in his collection one day he finds some mushrooms that are growing, and he consumes some of these mushrooms. And these are not the good mushrooms, but the bad mushrooms, and they cause him to hallucinate. And the the precise nature of these hallucinations is that it causes him to see his stockpile of saved resources, and instead of it being its actual size, it's 100 times bigger or 1,000 times bigger, just like this gigantic pile of coconuts and berries. You know, Crusoe is a millionaire in his own respect, right? So what we can ask then is, okay, how would Crusoe change his actions with this misguided, this incorrect view of his savings? And the answer is he would engage in totally different, much longer lines of production than he otherwise would have. Instead of going out and building a raft, perhaps, he might look at his massive pile. Remember, it's false, it's a hallucination. Look at this massive pile of saved resources and start building a mansion instead. Or instead of a fishing pole, he might start building this massive boat that he could, either take back to the Division of Labor or use for fishing. But the point is, his view, his own perception of the stockpile of saved resources determines the sorts of production projects that he would undertake, right? And so this is the same sort of thing that happens in the business cycle in a division of labor. There's something that happens to the supply of money and also to incomes and the interest rate that make it appear as if everybody, the entire economy has more resources set aside for production, or would allow us to pursue longer lines of production than currently exists. So there's a falsification of that perception. And that comes from outside of the market, either through central banking or through fractional reserve banking. When there's an increase in the supply of money that comes from somewhere besides, going into the ground and mining some gold. Okay, so Mises has a more straightforward analogy that doesn't involve any hallucinogenic drugs. So this is a great analogy. It's a wonderful one. So let me just read through it. Mises says, the whole entrepreneurial class is, as it were, in the position of a master builder whose task it is to erect a building out of a limited supply of building materials. If this man overestimates the quantity of the available supply, he drafts a plan for the execution of which the means at his disposal are not sufficient. He oversizes the groundwork and the foundations and only discovers later in the progress of the construction that he lacks the material needed for the completion of the structure. It is obvious that our master builder's fault was not in overinvestment, but an inappropriate employment of the means at his disposal. So there's this master builder who has an incorrect view of the resources that he has to complete the structure, and as a result, he starts building the wrong kind of house. He lays a foundation that's for a house that would be much bigger than what would be appropriate for the amount of resources that he actually has. So Mises makes this connection. It's a good analogy because it works both as an analogy for what entrepreneurs and what the economy experiences in a boom-bust cycle, but also in a literal sense, we actually see in some boom-bust cycles, whole neighborhoods are built that are based on this plan that's much bigger than can actually be completed. We saw this in the 07 and 08 recession, where it's like we look back in the past and it's like, oh wow, we planned to build this house, but we can't. We can't finish it. It's not profitable for us to do so. So that's why I think it's a great little story. Okay, so let's define a business cycle by first ruling out what business cycles are not. In America's Great Depression by Rothbard, he's very clear about this, that business cycles do not refer to regular, everyday industry or firm-specific fluctuations. So there are business fluctuations that happen all of the time due to changes in the market data, including consumer preferences, including our ideas about technology that we can use to produce different things, and the sheer amount of consumption and time preferences and the resources that we have at our disposal. These sorts of things are changing all of the time, and we've already seen that it's the task of the entrepreneurs in a great lecture by Dr. Klein, that it's the task of entrepreneurs to bear the uncertainty associated with these changes. So we're not sure what the future will hold. Entrepreneurs are tasked with this responsibility. So they're the ones who are putting resources on the line to try to make things that consumers want in the future. This sort of change, the changes that happen in the market like this are, we already have a theory, we already have this, we understand the mechanics of this. this is not a business cycle, because what we see on top of these sorts of changes is we see that there are general booms and general busts. And I just have a few graphs there. It's not quite as important for you to know like what these graphs are of, but just see the shapes of the lines. There's a stock market index in the top left, the unemployment rate is in the top right, gross output is in the bottom left, and then the Case-Shiller home price index is in the bottom right. But you'll notice the key feature of all these is that there's these big ups and downs, and these are things that apply to the economy as a whole. This is not a specific business fluctuation. This is not a change in consumer demand that an entrepreneur is trying to anticipate, and then they change their production accordingly. This is something that's happening to the entire economy, it seems. It might be that some industries are affected more than others, but nevertheless, it's something that applies to in general. So it's a general boom and then a general bust. So that's what we mean by a business cycle, and that's what our business cycle theory should explain. Another thing that we notice in business cycles is that we notice that consumer prices don't fluctuate as much as factor prices. So that's another thing that we need to take into account. Rothbard notes that capital goods industries fluctuate more widely than do the consumer goods industries. And we see a consumer price index on the left and the producer price index on the right. And you see that just using some eyeball metrics as opposed to econometrics. Yeah, that's right. So to do a little bit of stock taking, our theory needs to account for these things. We have to account for the shape and the stages of the cycle. We have a boom followed by a bust, and it's general. It's for the whole economy. We have to take into account the cluster of entrepreneurial errors, or at least explain what might be causing those errors to arise or to happen. And we also need to account for the more dramatic fluctuations in capital goods industries compared to consumer goods industries. And since this is something that happens to the economy as a whole, we immediately have a couple suspects. And that would be in money and in credit for a couple reasons. One is that money and credit pervade the entire economy. So in a money-using economy, 1/2 of all transactions has money on it. So if there's something that's affecting the entire economy, it would make sense to look at money since it's everywhere. And we might also be interested in looking at credit since it has such a big role in entrepreneurial decision making. The supply of credit allowing entrepreneurs to borrow and then undertake production projects for long periods of time. So those will be our suspect areas. Okay, so now that we have the groundwork and a definition, here's the outline for the rest of the lecture here. So first we'll recap the structure of production. We had a great lecture by Professor Rittenauer on that, but we'll just recap it since it's such an important part of this story. And we'll also recap time preference and interest. Once again, another great lecture by Professor Herbener. And we'll see how that the unhampered market economy is integrated and coordinated along both of these dimensions, or in both of these areas. So we have the production is structured in a certain way in stages, and then there's the time preference that we all have and the resulting social rate of time preference, or the interest rate that emerges that allows us to allocate resources across time. And so we'll see how those work together. And when we see how those work together, we'll see what is required for us to have sustainable economic growth. Understanding that production happens for certain reasons, what does it take for us to produce more? What does it take for us to have more consumer wants and needs satisfied? So we'll come up with a theory of sustainable growth, and then we'll ask the question, what could cause this to be messed up? What could cause this to be unsustainable as opposed to sustainable? Since we see that there's this boom that's inevitably followed by a bust, what happens in those sorts of booms that's not sustainable? And we'll see that the key to the story comes from overconsumption and malinvestment. So first, to recap the structure of production. Instead of flourless chocolate cake, I have bread that probably has flour in it, and it's being used to make a sandwich. And so this is following Rothbard. He uses this example. And usually when I'm teaching this in class, we'll have some back and forth, but for the sake of time, I'll do all of the work for you. So if we ask, what does it take to produce a ham sandwich, and we set it up in this way, where we just put the consumer good in the middle, and then we start putting the factors of production that are required to make the ham sandwich around it, we might have something that looks like this. So we need ham, we need bread, lettuce, some condiments, a plate, a table and chair to eat the ham sandwich at if this is at a deli. And we also need some space, so like some physical space that we would occupy to put the ham sandwich together and then consume it at the table, once again, if this is a deli. And we also need some labor. We need somebody to put all of these ingredients together at the deli. And as we all know from the previous lecture, this is not our stopping point because we can ask this same question again. So if we're asking where does the ham sandwich come from, we would also need to ask where does the ham come from? Where does the lettuce come from, and the bread, and all these other ingredients? We don't need to do that for land and labor since those are originary factors of production. So those are provided to us just by God. Like we just have physical space available to us and the ability for us to use human effort in production. So there's not an explanation behind that. They're originary. But when we do that, we see that there's another ring around the rosy here. So the butcher comes the ham comes from the butcher. The butcher needs some land and labor and other capital goods as well. The bakery has land, labor, oven, and flour. The flour comes from farming. I skipped a few steps there, as you'll see. And this just becomes a completely complicated mess. It's a very complex structure of production. And eventually, if we wanted to be thorough with this, it would end up looking something like this. It's extremely complex. And so what Austrians have done is that they've come up with two ways to simplify this so that we can actually work with it, because it's pretty impossible to work with this, right, in a way like you would move a demand curve on a supply and demand graph. So the way that we've organized it is by putting these nodes, the things that are happening in production, we put them in time. So we put the stuff that happens first on the left and then the stuff that happens last on the right. Or in some authors, they do higher to lower, so top to bottom. But the idea is this. We just shuffle everything around so we have the original starting factors of production on the left, and then we end with the consumer good on the right. This is still a little bit difficult to work with, but I would call your attention that this is very similar to Rothbard's figure 32 in Man, Economy, and State. If you turn your head to the side a little bit, you'll see that this is just land and labor being used to make capital goods through a structured production that ends with a consumer good at the end. Still a little bit intractable. So instead of having these nodes in a web form, we stack up the spending on all of the things that happen in those stages. So at the earliest stage of production, there's an amount of spending on all of those factors. Then there's another stage of production, and we can tally up the spending on all those things. So we've organized that giant, complex structured production just for a ham sandwich, and we've organized it by time on the horizontal dimension, and then by spending in the vertical dimension. And what we have is a nice, tractable structure of production as a result. Now, you might have heard the evenly rotating economy mentioned in a couple of the lectures. The evenly rotating economy it's a thought experiment. It's a construct, imaginary construct that we use to say what would happen if there's no more uncertainty. What happens if the market day repeats itself over and over, or whatever the market period is, if it repeats itself over and over again, such that there's no more uncertainty about what happens in the future. And one thing that we know is that all profits would go to zero. There'd be no more profits, since entrepreneurs, the source of profits is correctly guessing over and above what other people anticipate about the future, correctly guessing consumer demands for different goods. And so if you make everybody a perfect guesser by eliminating uncertainty, there's no more profit. However, an important conclusion from Mises and Rothbard is that there is still a spread between stages, and that's due to time preference. So since capitalists and entrepreneurs are being asked to part with present consumption by purchasing these factors of production earlier in the stages, and they only get the revenue until later, it means that they have to reckon their own time preferences as a result. And we've also seen from Professor Herpener's talk that there's some uniformity that happens, that because of arbitrage opportunities, the rate of interest that occurs in one line of production is the same that would apply to a different line of production, and also between the credit markets and also in production as well. So there's this uniformity that happens. So the only remaining spread between the stages of production is just interest. And in fact, this is the this is the more important, as Rothbard notes, the more important time market. It's the market for factors of production. It's bigger and more widespread as compared to a loanable funds market or a credit market, where we also see interest emerge. So the fact that we have trades of present money for future money occurs because we have varying rates of time preference. And so once again, time preference it's based on the fact that we have this disutility in waiting. I like to explain it in this way. So Mises said that all action is aimed at removing felt uneasiness. So all action, universally, this is not something we just notice as an imperial regularity. For action to be action, it means that there has to be this dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs. And so when we elongate the amount of time between starting an action and actually getting the payoff, getting the consumer good or the satisfaction, the desired state of affairs, it means that we're increasing the amount of time that we're experiencing that uneasiness that Mises talked about, or we're extending that amount of time that we had that dissatisfaction with the present state of affairs. And so that's why it's a praxeological thing and not just a psychological or empirical thing. So even though we all have time preference, there is a variety of rates, which means that we can trade. And I've got an example between David and Jeff here, where they have a double inequality of value for different amounts of money in different time periods, as opposed to like apples and oranges. They're trading money, but in different time periods, present and future. So we have an interest rate, and as we mentioned before, this interest rate is the same one that would apply in production, and we would see it as the slope of that triangle shape, the Hayekian triangle, in the evenly rotating economy. Okay, so to put all of that together, so we have the structure of production, time preference, and interest. We have intertemporal coordination. So we have consumers that have certain time preferences, and entrepreneurs' plans are limited by this. They're limited by the set of resources that have been not consumed. Like, so there's some resources that are consumed in any given time period and some that are set aside for investment in production. And so that's a limiting factor for entrepreneurs. They can only pursue the lines of production that are enabled by the resources at their disposal. And so I'm saying it in this way, but all of that happens through credit markets and through the structured production and the rates of return that happen between stages. But it's the same sort of thing that would apply to Crusoe when he's deciding what lines of production am I going to pursue. Am I going to pursue really long ones? Do I have a large stockpile of coconuts and berries that would enable me to make more capital goods and pursue X, Y, and Z? Or do I have a smaller set of saved resources that would only allow me to produce A, B, and C, right? So it's the same sort of thing happening socially in this regard. It's just all happening through, once again, market prices, profit and loss. Okay, so the only projects that are deemed profitable are the ones in which the anticipated discounted revenues from the sale of output exceed the cost of production. So there's this limiting factor. Entrepreneurs can only start lines of production that meet that threshold. And the threshold is determined at least in part by time preferences, because we have to discount those revenues in the future to make a comparison to the cost of production today. So entrepreneurs do not undertake projects that would take too long, and I know that's not a very precise term there. So if we define too long as there's insufficient resources to complete them, or perhaps there are more urgently desired projects. So an example here might be like, suppose Crusoe makes a mistake in which he decides to start producing a toaster instead of a fishing net, and so the creation of the toaster to make toast, that requires a lot of other effort, and the payoff there would be much further down the road, as opposed to if he could make a net that would allow him to catch fish tomorrow, perhaps. So he could make a mistake that's not just based on the set of available resources, but it's also just a mistake based on what is more urgent. What do I desire when? And as we've seen, the rate of interest is uniform across lines of production and across or between consumption and production. Okay, so we see this intertemporal coordination, but now we need to ask the question, based on our outline, is how do we get sustainable growth? How does our economy grow in a way that doesn't have this inevitable bust? And the answer is with saving. So we actually have to bolster our savings first. We have to set aside resources away from consumption and toward production so that we can produce more. So saving involves freeing up resources for production. In credit markets, we see this by saved funds are made available to entrepreneurs, and these entrepreneurs, with the lower interest rate and the availability of funds itself, they're able to purchase additional factors of production and pursue new, longer, different lines of production. So, and those new, longer lines of production would be in line with consumers' time preferences, because you remember we started off the scenario with consumers decided to save more. So we have an increase in savings, and entrepreneurs are responding accordingly. There's a coordination there. And the initial investment, if it's in excess of what's required to just maintain and replace the existing capital stock, this would pay off in the future with an expanded set of resources. So if we create new capital goods, if we bolster production, if we consume less today and add to our productive capabilities, it means that in the future we have more stuff, more goods and services, both more capital goods and more consumer goods, right? Because we've increased production today. But the important point is that this comes at a cost, right? You have to forego some consumption. You have to not consume some stuff so that those resources can be used in production. That's the important point. And there's no way around it, right? There's not a way for us to just increase production and increase consumption, right, with a given set of resources, right? We're just stuck with that. So that's our explanation of sustainable economic growth. The way we get sustainable economic growth is by saving first. Okay, so next question is, what if instead of saving money, instead of saving more, what if that increased supply of loanable funds comes from the printing presses, where we just have brand new money is entering the scene and it's coming in through credit markets. It's not coming from people deciding to consume less, and then those resources can be used in production. But what if it comes from something outside the market? Perhaps a central bank increasing the money supply frantically. And so here, instead of calling this scenario an increase in savings, since it's falsified, we'll call this an artificial credit expansion. So in this case, newly created money enters the economy through credit markets, and it represents an increased supply of loanable funds. But one important point is we're going to say that time preferences don't change. So the consumer time preferences and like what would have happened on the market is just the same. And so this is just a new drop of money that's coming in through credit markets, but people's time preferences haven't changed. All right, so what are the effects of this? Well, this would decrease the interest rate, so it's increasing the supply of loanable funds, and so the interest rate comes down, the market price in the loanable funds market, and it's not because of a change in time preference. And at the lower interest rate, and also just because incomes can increase now that there's an expanded money supply. So we have inflation, there's new money, so incomes increase and the interest rate falls. And so this enables or encourages consumers to save less and to consume more. So we actually have the opposite occurring. In real terms, we don't have an increase in savings, we have a decrease in savings as a result of this money pouring forth on the credit market. So consumption and borrowing increase, and firms take the new funds, entrepreneurs take the new funds and invest in new, longer lines of production. From the entrepreneur's perspective, this looks like, hey, now the projects that I thought would not be profitable, they now appear profitable. It's the same as the mushrooms in Crusoe's case. From their perspective, they see the interest rate is lower, we can borrow now, at a rate that would allow us to deem this project that was off limits. Now it is within our feasible set of like profitable lines of production. So like now we can pursue this line of production that we couldn't before. As a result of this, factor prices increase. So entrepreneurs' demands for factors of production increase in the early stages of production. So now they create new capital goods and they increase their demand for labor in the early stages of production, which means that factor prices increase, wages increase, employment increases, consumption increases, and investment spending increases. Not only do we have this boost in business in the early stages of production, but we also have a boom in the later stages at the retail end because of the increased consumption. So both at the retail end, but also in the earliest stages, there's this boom that happens. And as a result, it looks like the economy is doing great. It looks like we just have profits are abounding, incomes are up, wages are up, employment is up, stock prices are up. It's just a wonderful time, right? As we know, this can't last, however, because we're now in the unsustainable portion of the lecture. Okay, so we have this boom that's general. It's not in just one sector. It's not just in one industry, but it's for the entire economy. So the key here, what prevents this boom from going on forever is we do have a real resource constraint. We only have a certain number of resources. The projects that were started cannot be completed. At some point, Crusoe, in his hallucinations, he would realize, or the master builder in Mises' case, they would realize, I don't have the resources that are required to finish the projects that I had started. Like, it just can't happen. And this would appear in a few different ways. One way is that the prices of capital goods might increase as we see the increasing scarcity of capital goods. We might see the interest rate shoot up, or that might happen first, in which the projects that we expected to be able to do based on easy credit, now it's not possible for us to do that because interest rates are increasing. But the point is that we have overconsumption and malinvestment. So overconsumption is the fact that the new profits and incomes and higher net worth calculations and the lower interest rate, all of those combined encourage increased consumption, more consumption than what would have happened absent the artificial credit. So resources move from real resources, not just spending, but real resources move from the early to the late stages due to that increased consumption. And this is something that Salerno highlights in his article in the QJ that I mentioned at the beginning. And we also have malinvestment. And malinvestment is the fact that resources are misallocated. So it's not like, oh, we move resources from these lines to these lines, but let's just finish it out. It's like, no, it's a misallocation because it wasn't based on available resources. It wasn't based on consumers' time preferences. These projects physically have to be abandoned, both financially and physically. It's like, this is not going to pan out. And so the inflation and the artificially low interest rates encourage that misallocation. And it's especially difficult in capital goods industries. As we mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that our theory has to explain is the greater fluctuation in capital goods industries. And the reason why is because specific capital goods are created during the boom. Specific meaning they're especially suited for one particular line of production. As opposed to labor, which is relatively non-specific, it's easier for us to find new profitable employment for labor as opposed to the capital goods that were created in the boom. So in sum, the credit expansion does not represent an increase in real resources available for consumption or investment. And I think we've covered all of these points here. The projects just have to be abandoned because the resources aren't there. So what happens in the bust? What happens in the recession? We see firms liquidating the malinvested capital. Wages decrease as these projects are abandoned. Workers are laid off. But due to like I said, the relative non-specificity of labor, this is a little bit easier than the capital goods, which see a severe drop in their value. Credit markets dry up, so there's more uncertainty. We could have what's called a secondary deflation. It's based on the as Salerno calls it in his article, an entrepreneurial malaise that occurs because there's all this extra uncertainty due to capital values dropping and the recession and all the unemployment. So we might see this reluctance for lending to pick back up as a result. And we also see prices readjusting to reflect consumer demands. It's important to point out that the bust is a correction phase. So here, it's like a recovery. It's like we're fixing the mistakes. So the mistake was we allocated resources to very long lines of production, and we have to move those resources into new lines of production that actually will pan out. So, and that's what happens in the recession. It's a healthy period, even though it's painful. It's just one of those things. Like it hurts, yeah, to see wages decrease. These sorts of things are painful to see your perhaps your retirement account decreases in value because the stock market is tanking. But the point is that from a bird's eye view, this is healthy. This is what the economy needs to do as a result of all of the mistakes of the past. The reason I point that out is because a lot of the government response to recessions and the bust that happens is to worsen or to hamper this recovery phase. So they'll try to prop up wages, they'll try to increase government spending, they'll even increase the money supply once again to try to maintain total expenditures, for example. But from the Austrian view, we'll see that this actually hurts the recovery process, and you're actually just paving the way for another bust in the future. So I have just a little bit of time. I thought I would contrast it to some popular views. So there's the Keynesian view, and it's totally different. It's almost like a complete opposite of the story that I just told you. In the Keynesian view, busts come out of nowhere, usually from this hard to describe instability in investment spending. So like there are these capitalists that they're operating on whims. They have these animal spirits that are either optimistic or pessimistic, and so they just all of a sudden people just get pessimistic and they pull their funds out of the market, and so investment spending tanks, and since investment spending, as you'll see, is a component of total expenditure there, total income, it means that total expenditures falls, and according to the Keynesian view, while wages, there would be a decreased demand for labor, but wages don't come down for whatever reason. We just have sticky wages, and so markets don't clear in labor markets. We have persistent unemployment, and so we have this doubling down effect, or a spiraling downward effect, where this one decrease in investment spending turns into another decrease in spending because of the uncertainty and the extra waning animal spirits as a result. And there's nothing within the market economy that can fix it in the Keynesian view. So the only hope here, I told you this is totally opposite, the only hope is government. The only thing that can step in and increase the total expenditures is government spending. And modern Keynesians would say that we could also use the central bank to increase the money supply that would also stimulate additional expenditure. But this is the only thing that we can do to get us back to that full employment level of expenditure. And what's interesting is that the Keynesians and the monetists are viewed as opposing schools of thought sometimes. But you'll notice that when we contrast to the monetarist view, it's exactly the same, right? It's like the story is almost the same. Instead of there being this sudden decrease in investment spending, we have this sudden decrease in the money supply or in the growth rate of the money supply, depending on who you ask. And this causes total expenditures to fall. Sticky wages prevent labor markets from clearing, and we have a crash. And the only hope in this view is we need the central bank or some sort of monetary authority to increase the money supply so that we can get back to the full employment level of expenditures. And so instead of the y is equal to c plus I plus g, they're using this equation of exchange to help them tell that story. It's interesting because both Milton Friedman and Rothbard would blame the Federal Reserve for causing the Great Depression, right? Or at least that boom bust cycle. They both pinned the blame on the central bank in that case, but for totally opposite reasons. If you ask Rothbard, it was based on the growth in credit through the mid to late 20s that caused the Great Depression, or the crash that led to the recession and then the depression. And if you ask Milton Friedman, he would say, yeah, the Federal Reserve is at fault because they did not increase the money supply, right? So they didn't increase the money supply when they should have. They should have seen that all these banks were falling, and they should have maintained the money supply by being a lender of last resort and just increasing M. So notice they're both blaming the Fed, but for totally opposite reasons. In fact, if you compare monetarism and Keynesianism, there's a lot of similarities there. So in conclusion here, if you look at the highly aggregated data, if you're not looking at the stages of production and the intertemporal coordination that happens with time preference and interest and production, then you will misdiagnose the problem. If you're looking at total expenditures or just changes in the money supply, for example, you'll misdiagnose the problem and you will also give bad solutions. Another thing that we've noticed in the process is that we had to first come up with a theory of sustainable economic growth. So how does our economy grow in a sustainable way? And this is, goes back to Hayek's maxim. It goes like this: before we can meaningfully ask what might go wrong, we should first understand how things could ever go right. And so we see how economies can grow if we have an increase in savings, and we have the unsustainable growth if it's triggered by false savings or fake credit emerging in credit markets. And so in conclusion, sustainable growth is based on a real reallocation of resources away from consumption and towards production. So we have to have real savings. And unsustainable booms are caused by artificial increases in credit, and the recessions are the time in which we fix the mistakes that we made during that unsustainable boom in the past. Thank you.
Check one, check two. Sound booth, are you there? Good. Check one, check two. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats so we can begin. We're going to talk today about competition and monopoly. But first, how about that huge psychological psychic profit from yesterday's lecture? Come on, let's hear it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Connor. Economists of all stripes talk about the importance of competition and how we benefit as a society from having a competitive market economy. We want policies to avoid monopoly. We think monopoly is a concern. Monopoly causes reductions in overall well-being and so forth. Almost everyone agrees that competition is desirable and that monopoly is something to be avoided. But what do these terms mean? I mean, what is competition? What is monopoly? Well, monopoly has been in the news quite a lot lately, as you've already heard in some other lectures, because we're told by the smart set that monopoly is one of the major factors, if not the most important factor, driving the increase in consumer prices to where, price inflation is now at the highest it's been in more than 3 decades. So the Biden administration tells us that one of the big problems is overly concentrated markets, too much monopoly power, the exploitation of the consumer by entrenched monopolists. That is what is responsible for price increases. Even Biden's Council of Economic Advisors has gotten into the act with a lot of reports about particular industries, in this case meatpacking, saying, look, what's really explaining prices, it's not an increase in the money supply, as some of us might think, but it's greed, corporate greed. Why greed has suddenly gone up and then greed apparently has gone down a little bit in the last 2 weeks is never really explained. Senator Warren graciously includes Putin as well as another source of inflation, but it's mostly corporate monopolies. The website Socialist Appeal asks provocatively, who's to blame for inflation? Workers' wages or corporate profits? Gosh, I wonder which way they're going to come down on that. Okay, so if monopoly is this bad thing that's causing price increases, what is it? And if it's bad, what would we do to stop it or rein it in? Well, if you talk to the average economics professor or economists, talking head types on TV, what they mean by monopolist or monopoly is typically, a firm that has a large share of the market, that has a large share of a particular industry, or to be more technical, if a firm has a market share above X, then that firm has monopoly power, or alternatively, that firm is a monopolist, or alternatively, this market is monopolized, and therefore, action needs to be taken. Well, what exactly is X? You might think, oh, X has got to be 100, right? But no. It's hard to identify any industries or sectors defined in conventional ways where you have market shares of 100%, right? think about web search, right? Google search engine has about 90% of the global search market. Okay, so 90% market share seems pretty big. If you want to say, oh, Google's got a monopoly on search, okay, well, maybe that's not technically correct, but that doesn't seem all that outlandish a claim. Well, I mean, what about Amazon? So most recent data give Amazon about a 56% share of global retail sales. I mean, that's pretty big for one company, 56%, right? That's 56% of global online sales, not brick and mortar sales as well. So 56% of the online marketplace, that seems pretty big. I mean, is Amazon a monopolist in online retail? I mean, it doesn't seem like it. There's lots of other retailers from whom you can buy online. You can buy from small companies direct. You can buy on eBay. If you're in other parts of the world, you can buy on many other platforms that are rivals to Amazon. So it's a big market share, but it doesn't seem like, I don't know, would that qualify for the monopoly label? You might say, but wait a minute, Amazon's primary revenue earning business is, I'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, it's not actually retail sales, it's cloud, Amazon Web Services, cloud hosting. So Amazon's market share in cloud hosting services is about 33%. Okay, so is Amazon a monopolist of the cloud? Yeah. Is it a monopolist of online retail? Yeah. I mean, no matter what example readily comes to mind of what conventionally is called a monopolist, whatever that market share is, it's not totally clear if it meets some sort of magic number. I mean, a cynical person would almost think that politicians and interventionists choose the X to give them the answer that they want when they're condemning a particular firm, but of course I would never suggest that publicly. A more technical way to think about this in the language of sort of mainstream microeconomic theory is to claim that a firm has monopoly power, maybe it's not a monopolist, but it has some monopoly power, if it has the ability to raise price above marginal cost. In other words, any firm that can charge a higher price than what it cost that firm to produce a unit of a good or service, according to the one theory, can only do so if it has some kind of control over the market. It can manipulate consumers somehow. It can jack up the price over what the price should be in a more competitive situation. Related to this is the claim that, well, any firm that is earning a positive economic profit, any firm that earns revenues in excess of its costs can only be doing so because of some kind of nefarious monopoly power. Now, we already had some conversation yesterday about the role played by uncertainty in the generation of profit and loss. So, of course, a model like this doesn't make any sense in a world where future revenues to the entrepreneur are uncertain at the time the entrepreneur has to make investment by purchasing factors of production, combining resources, and so forth. But the sort of standard, mostly static models that you get in mainstream economics texts do not include any role for uncertainty in those models. I just want to note at the outset, and you know this if you've read Murray Rothbard's writings on competition and monopoly, that these definitions are very different from the sort of classical common law notion of monopoly. What was the definition of monopoly until the early to mid 20th century is a monopoly was a special privilege granted by the sovereign, granted by the king, or granted by the state. This is some of you may recognize that symbol. That was a symbol of the Dutch East India Company. Right? When we say the Dutch East India Company had a monopoly on trade between the Netherlands and Indonesia and the other islands of the Far East in the 17th century, 18th century. We don't mean the Dutch East India Company had a 33% market share. Right? What we mean is it was illegal for anyone else to engage in long-distance trade between the Dutch Republic and the Far East. Right? You would go, you would go to jail if you were caught. You might be shot, by the Dutch Navy, and your ship would be sunk. Your cargo would be confiscated because the king has said, right? The state has said only this company may engage in that activity. Right? So. You sometimes see these old European companies that will advertise, in the old days, by order of His Majesty, we were the official provider of XYZ in the UK or wherever. That's what it meant to have a monopoly. The state says only you can engage in this activity. So now we speak about, the postal monopoly. Well, people like us talk about the postal monopoly. Now, there are many ways that you can engage in communication with other people, but it is illegal for anyone other than an employee of the United States Postal Service to put a piece of paper into your officially licensed postal mailbox. Okay, maybe you live in a city or a town where there's only one electricity provider or one water company, or maybe even only one internet, one broadband provider in your neighborhood, because only one company has been given the legal privilege to operate in that industry. Okay, so how and why the definition of monopoly changed from a privilege granted by the state to success in the marketplace through any means is an interesting story, and we'll have something to say about that a little bit later. Now, I'm going to talk about the views of Austrian economists on these questions, and there is some variety of opinion among Austrian scholars, writers and thinkers in the Austrian tradition about how to think about monopoly, what are some things that might be done to address monopoly, and there are many issues within the Austrian tradition where, while all practitioners share a commitment to a certain set of foundational principles that define the Austrian approach, they don't agree on all of the details, and this is one of these issues. So it's probably useful for us to start by thinking about monopoly in contrast to, not monopoly, i.e. competition. Right? So both Austrians and mainstream economists understand monopoly as the absence of competition or a state of affairs that's not competitive. So it's useful to start by thinking about what we mean by competition. Right? Well, in everyday language, right, what we mean by competition is some kind of a contest, or there's some sort of rivalry, like in sports, Auburn University is trying to beat the University of Alabama, its arch rival in football, in a football competition. This is a picture of a legendary chess match that took place at the Mises Institute some years ago between Tom Woods, who's slightly standing up, and Walter Block. Both are very skilled chess players, and I won't tell you what happened. You'll have to ask Tom Woods or Walter Block, but we talk about I'm entering a competition in sports, or my school has this is a very competitive school. It's hard to get in, or it's hard to graduate from this school because it's highly competitive. So a situation of competition is one in which different parties are competing, and we also sometimes use competition in an adjective form, more competitive or less competitive. So the competition is more intense somehow, or more tough than it would be if it's less competitive. And as I mentioned before, in the common law tradition, competition exists where the state has not granted a special exclusive privilege to one producer, one firm, one entrepreneur. Once we get to 20th century mainstream economics, I guess these ideas were introduced in the latter part of the 19th century and became fairly standard by the 1920s, 1930s, certainly by World War II in the English-speaking world. The notion of competition was changed to mean something else. Right? So neoclassical economists have developed a particular sort of theoretical model or analytical model for understanding how markets work that is said to describe a certain kind of competition, a pure or perfect kind of competition. Talk about this construct of perfect competition as well as imperfect competition in just a moment. As I said before, the hallmark of perfect competition is, or a competitive market in this model, is a market in which firms do not have the ability to charge prices that they want, right? They can only get prices for the goods and services that they sell that are given to them by sort of anonymous market forces. They can't earn any profits because they can't charge prices above their marginal costs. And we'll look at some Austrian differences of opinion or criticism of this as well. So you may have, how many of you have seen a picture like this from your undergrad econ class or econ textbook? It's sort of a graphical representation of a perfectly competitive firm. And so the idea with this firm is, there's so many firms let's say it's wheat. It's the wheat farmer, proverbial wheat farmer, right? He has a little plot of land and he harvests some wheat and he takes his wheat to the wheat market and sells it. And he's just one of many producers, right? So there are no big producers that exercise a lot of influence in this market. It's kind of anonymous, right? So, this farmer has so there's quantity on the horizontal axis, prices on the vertical axis. The idea is he's got an upward sloping marginal cost curve, like any producer, and he has a U-shaped average cost curve, again, like you would find in the typical case. What's unique for this firm is because it's just one little tiny drop in the bucket of this giant market, this farmer, he sort of goes to market every day and he finds out that the price of wheat that day is so many dollars per bushel. And then he can sell as much wheat as he wants at that price without it affecting that price. In other words, it's not the case that if he sells if he doubles his wheat production, that's going to somehow drive down the market price, because he's so teeny tiny compared to the market. He doesn't have any influence on the market. Right? Likewise, if he decides to withhold his production from the market, reducing the total supply of wheat, he's so small relative to the market that doesn't have any influence. That doesn't drive up the price. Okay, it's a little bit like, he said, well, then where does the price come from? Well, there's like an industry or market level supply and demand diagram out there somewhere, which is determining the market price of wheat. But the point is, each producer is so small that changing their quantity doesn't have any discernible impact on the total supply of wheat in the market. It's a little bit like, the old, paradox of voting, right? I mean, what determines who wins the election? Well, whoever got the most votes. But if Anton decides not to vote, it has no effect on the outcome. Anton's vote, because he's one out of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands voting, same person's going to win no matter what Anton does. And the same thing's going to happen no matter what Connor does and no matter what I do. And so you think, well, wait a minute, but if no individual voter's vote has an effect on the outcome, then where does the outcome come from? Well, it's everybody's vote. It's like, oh gosh, that's like a brain teaser. Okay, it's the same sort of idea here. Each producer is so small that none can influence the market because the market is so large. Therefore, the demand curve facing the producer is not the conventional downward sloping demand curve. It's rather a horizontal or perfectly elastic demand curve. The farmer can sell as much wheat as he wants at the going price without affecting that price. Therefore, the marginal revenue received by the farmer for each unit sold is just the same as the market price. I sell one, market price is $10 a bushel. I sell one bushel, I get 10 bucks. I sell a second bushel, I get 10 bucks for that one. I sell a third bushel, I get 10 bucks for that one, right? As opposed to the more conventional case of a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. The more I sell to sell more, I've got to drop the price, so I get less per unit and I get a lower marginal revenue for each unit that I sell. That doesn't apply for this person, for this producer, because the market is quote unquote perfectly competitive. So the farmer chooses, where's my laser on here? Sorry. Oh, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Yeah, so the farmer chooses the quantity where marginal revenue, which is this horizontal line, is equal to marginal cost. Here's the competitive market price, PC, that's determined by the market, external to the farmer. And the farmer chooses to produce this quantity, the perfectly competitive quantity. With a little bit more diagrammatic, if we add a little more to our diagram, we can show that this farmer's total revenue is exactly equal to his total cost. So there's no profit, zero profit, nothing left over. All this happens in the short run. The theory says that in the longer run, suppose that the demand for wheat should fall. Everybody decides to go gluten-free or whatever. And consumers don't like wheat anymore, so that shifts the demand curve in the wheat market to the left. And so the market price of wheat will fall. So this number will go down and the farmer will see that horizontal demand curve fall. So in the short run, that would cause him to earn an economic loss, because now his total revenues fall short of his total cost. But then farmers would start to exit the market because they're making a loss, and the exit of farmers would eventually move the supply curve back for the industry back to the left until we return to this zero profit kind of long run equilibrium. That's the story in a nutshell. And the neoclassical economists say, wow, isn't this great? This is so efficient. It's so welfare maximizing, right? I mean, the market gets as much wheat as the market, can possibly consume. Producers don't earn profit, and profits are bad. We don't want greedy profiteers to make money, right? So the farmers just barely break even. They don't earn any income. Consumers pay the lowest possible prices for the goods and services that they consume. Everything's perfectly efficient. Consumer welfare is maximized. Okay. Now you might think, well, this is sort of an interesting intellectual exercise, but what does this have to do with wheat in the real world? I mean, the answer is very little, right? Because no actual market could possibly have these characteristics, right? No matter how small you are as a producer relative to the market, your actions do have some impact, albeit potentially small, on what happens in that market. It's not the case, as it is assumed here, that every producer's output is identical to the consumer to every other producer's output. That's why when I was in school, they always used the wheat market as the example of, well, okay, it's not literally perfectly competitive, but it's kind of close because it's just wheat. Well, if you know anything about food or agriculture, or even if you've ever been to a restaurant or a grocery store, I mean, there's tons of different kinds of wheat. There's organic wheat, and there's non-organic wheat, and there's there's winter wheat and red wheat number 2. I mean, there's like dozens of different grades and qualities of wheat. There's GMO-free wheat, and there's wheat laden with chemicals, and there's all different kinds of wheat that you could buy. And in fact, now one of the big issues in agriculture, you might have heard of what they call traceability, is when you buy a loaf of bread in the store, you want some system where you can find out exactly which farm the grain came from. And it's a big problem for the food system because it's not really designed that way. You dump all the wheat into a big bin and then you ship it off to the next stage. But the point is, even the wheat market doesn't in any way resemble the assumptions of perfect competition. So why do we care about this? Well, because according to this theory, there's another kind of scenario you could imagine in which the market is not perfectly competitive, in which in fact some firms, or maybe all firms, have what they call market power or monopoly power. What does market power mean? It's not, the Rothbardian notion of coercion. It's not coercive power. It's like price-setting power, whatever that means exactly. So the idea here is, imagine a firm, say it's, Google, it's the only producer of the thing that it produces. Actually, let's not use Google because we don't actually buy Google services. We get them for free. Let's say diamond, De Beers, the De Beers Diamond Company. Let's assume it owns all the diamonds in the world. Well, it's the only producer of diamonds, so the market for diamonds of De Beers, according to this assumption, is the same as the global market for diamonds, because it's the only diamond producer in the world, let's say. Okay, therefore, if this is the demand for diamonds, that's also the demand for De Beers output, because De Beers is the only diamond company. So unlike the perfectly competitive wheat farmer, who has this perfectly elastic horizontal demand curve for his product, the evil diamond monopolist, right, has a downward sloping demand for its product and a downward sloping marginal revenue curve that is more steeply sloped and lies below the demand curve. You can look up why if you've forgotten. So this producer also chooses the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So here's the marginal cost curve, and the marginal revenue curve is this green line, so where marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect is this quantity QM. So that's the monopolist's profit maximizing quantity. But wait, okay, this monopolist exercising its nefarious power, right, does not price the product right here. It says, oh, well, wait a minute. This is the quantity I want to produce. I'm going to charge the most the market will bear, which means I'm going to jump right all the way up to where that quantity lies on the demand curve. Scoot to the left and look right here. Here's the monopoly price. So the monopolist produces this much QM and charges this price PM. Well, wait a minute. What does that mean? That means that there's this whole area under the curve, this sort of purplish blue area, which is extra revenue that goes to the producer, i.e. profit. That's the so-called monopoly profit. If you have seen this before, you know that there's another little piece here where they say, well, there's this area here that they call consumer surplus. That's like the difference between what consumers would have been willing to pay and what they actually had to pay, because this is the price they have to pay. So the consumers get this as some kind of utility gain. I know it's silly. The producers, the sellers, get this as profit. But wait a minute, there's this little yellow triangle. That's like utility or benefit that somebody could have gotten, but nobody gets. It just like disappears into the ether. And this is said to be an efficiency loss, right? Gosh, because if we could somehow get, if we had a competitive market for diamonds, right, then the quantity would be where the marginal cost curve hits the demand curve, like we had in the previous graph, and that would be here. So a perfectly competitive industry would produce this much, and this is the price that would be charged. But under monopoly, we get a smaller quantity produced, and the prices paid by consumers are higher, and there's this mysterious yellow triangle that disappears into the ether. Okay, you can go back to your mainstream textbook and look up the details if you've forgotten. But the point is that this is supposed to be, harmful to consumers. Consumers are worse off than they would be under competition, and it's like even worse for everybody because of this inefficient deadweight loss. So according to economists who think this is a useful way of describing reality, we got to do whatever we can to make this world look more like this one. How do we do it? Well, we use antitrust to break up the diamond company and force it to be 5 diamond companies, although how that would be perfectly competitive is left to the imagination, right? Or we need the government to regulate the price and force the price to be down here. And there's all kinds of different things under the guise of so-called competition policy that are meant to try to force an actual market to look more like the hypothetical, perfectly competitive market. I mean, there are a lot of problems with this model, a lot of problems with this way of thinking about the world, right? So Rothbard emphasized this point that I hinted at earlier, that in a real market, right, every seller contributes some quantity to the total market output, right? These mathematical models are using, smooth and continuous curves where everything's twice differentiable and so forth, meaning they're thinking sort of infinitesimally small units. Rothbard says, no, but in the actual real world of human action, we only work with discrete units of goods and services that make sense to the human mind, actions that could conceivably be taken, not mathematical abstractions. There's another point, too, that is not always appreciated in the mainstream literature. I mean, if you really think about what anti-monopoly or competition policy, as it's understood by mainstream scholars, is meant to do, they're saying that diamond company, it's only producing this many diamonds per year. If the market were perfectly competitive, it would be producing this higher quantity of diamonds. It's like it's withholding diamonds from the market that the market needs, wants, deserves. If you think about it, it's kind of like, well, but why should a producer be required to sell some particular quantity? Right? I mean, all producers limit their output in some sense relative to some theoretical maximum because they don't work 24/7. They take coffee breaks and bathroom breaks. I mean, I like to use an example from the movies. If you think about my doppelganger, George Clooney, let's say he makes, 5 movies per year. In the old days, in the old studio system, the golden age of Hollywood in the 1930s, 1940s, actors would make, 20 or 30 films a year. Let's say George Clooney makes 5 films a year. And somebody like that, he's pretty choosy about what he does, right? He doesn't take every role that's offered to him. He picks a few roles that are good for his image or that he thinks will be blockbuster films, or, he wants to do an art house film or whatever. But, he's not working 24/7. I mean, according to the tabloids, he's got many nice houses and nice cars, and he's hanging out by the pool a lot, okay? Also like me. So, if you take the sort of anti-monopoly language and concept seriously, you think, well, it would be more efficient if we could somehow compel George Clooney to make more movies. Okay, well, let's say we allow him 8 hours of sleep per day. I mean, 16 hours a day, he should be making films. And if he only makes films 15 hours a day, he's withholding some of his output from society. and he's lowering consumer welfare. And we should legally compel him to produce as much as he can. Okay, well, that seems silly. That sounds like slavery. That sounds like compulsion. But okay, but then why do we say that Amazon is producing a monopoly quantity rather than the competitive quantity? Therefore, the state needs to compel Amazon to increase its quantity of whatever. How is that really different from compelling George Clooney to make more movies? It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Another thing to point out is that things like elasticity of demand, right? The fact that the demand curve for diamonds is downward sloping, and maybe it's a highly inelastic demand, which gives the producer a lot of ability to increase price without decreasing the quantity. I mean, is that bad? Is that wrong? Is that inefficient? Well, in a free market, right, consumers can choose voluntarily what to buy, what not to buy. And even something like elasticity of demand, the existence of substitutes and so forth, is the result of voluntary human choice, right? It's the result of preference. In other words, you say, well, the reason that De Beers has so much price-setting power is because diamonds are unique. If you forget about the industrial use of diamonds for a moment, but just focus on their use in jewelry. Well, there's no substitute for a diamond. That's what the ads tell me, right? That there are other jewels, but they're just not as shiny and pretty. They don't mean the same thing. For an engagement ring, it's got to be a diamond, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, but I mean, that's because consumers have made that choice, right? Consumers could decide that, a fake diamond is just as good as a real diamond, or an emerald or a ruby is just as good as a diamond. Or if I want to propose to my fiance, I can give her a little rubber band to put around her finger. That should be just as good. The fact that she says that's not acceptable, right, that doesn't constitute market failure in some sense, in any sense, right? I mean, that's just the preference of the market, and it's impossible for us as value-free economists to say, well, that preference is inefficient, that preference is wrong. More elastic demand is better than inelastic demand. For consumers to believe that there are more substitutes for a product is better than for consumers to believe there are fewer substitutes. Why? Why would it be? Okay. What does Mises say? So Mises has a very valuable discussion of monopoly in Human Action, but also there's an article that was published a few years ago in a New English translation in the QJAE on monopoly prices. First of all, note Mises, he doesn't refer to monopoly as like a state of affairs. He only refers to monopoly in the context of pricing. Mises says there are some market conditions under which the prices that emerge are different from the prices that would emerge under other more competitive conditions. And he says we can't identify monopoly prices in theory. He says monopoly prices emerge only under special conditions. And those conditions are you have a single seller of a good or service, or a cartel of sellers selling that good or service, and an inelastic demand curve, a demand curve that is inelastic above the price that would have otherwise obtained had there been more sellers or multiple sellers of this good or service. And he argues that, well, under those conditions, consumers are not actually getting exactly what they would prefer to get. That there's sort of, consumer sovereignty doesn't completely hold in this particular case. But he says this is really just an issue of theoretical interest. Mises says, in reality, the conditions that would give rise to monopoly pricing are extremely rare. They just don't occur that much in history. It's not really a big deal. It's not relevant for policy, and so forth. I mean, for example, again, this notion of what is or isn't a substitute is something that is not given to us by nature or technology. That's something that's given to us by subjective preference, right? So what does it mean? You're the only person selling X. Well, is Y a good substitute for X? If so, then you're not the only person selling X and Y together, okay? So Mises says in practice, this sort of theoretically interesting but not practically relevant. So Rothbard offered, what for a long time was taken as sort of a critique of Mises, but I think it's better understood as like a refinement of Mises, a clarification of Mises' argument. Rothbard says, well, look, I mean, all sellers face a downward sloping demand curve for reasons that we already mentioned. There are no horizontal, perfectly elastic demand curves. So all sellers try to get the highest price they think they can get for the goods and services that they're trying to sell. So in practice, there's no way for us to distinguish a particular price that emerges on the market. No way for us to identify it as being a monopoly price in Mises' sense or a competitive price in Mises' sense. Again, assuming that there are no government restrictions on who can be in that market or who cannot. So Rothbard would say, yeah, I mean, if you have an exclusive grant from the state, then you do have, the prices that you charge are different from the prices that would have obtained if you didn't have that special license or privilege from the state. But in the absence of state intervention, all we can say is that every producer tries to earn the highest profit that they can. And of course, remember, as we discussed yesterday, producers are making decisions about what to do, what resources to obtain, how to combine them, in anticipation of prices that will prevail in the future when their stuff's ready for sale. Right? And of course, they might be wrong about that. So ex ante, they're making their production plans with the anticipation of earning the highest possible profit. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But the elasticity of demand and the number of producers in the market, absent legal restrictions, doesn't change that fundamental logic of what every producer is doing. And so analytically, there really isn't any way to separate them the way that Mises wants to do. Again, with the exception of government-granted monopoly. An example that even mainstream economists would recognize as a government-granted monopoly is a patent. Right? If you have a patent on a technology or a product, then no one else is allowed legally to compete with your product or service for a specified time, 17 years or whatever is the life of the patent. And of course, there's always some ambiguity over how the market or the technology is defined. That's why we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on patent lawsuits, right, where people go to court to try to get the court to figure out what rights the patent actually protects, whether or not some other action is an infringement of the patent as well. Things like, the Dutch East India Company, licenses, grants, charters, the local electric company, telephone monopoly, postal monopoly would be examples. But there are other instances of things that grant sort of monopoly privilege in this sense without being exactly the same as an exclusive license, like a lot of other policies that restrict trade. If you're a steel manufacturer in the US, and as happened during the Trump administration, there's an increased tariff on imported steel, say from China, right, that reduces the number of firms competing for the American steel users' patronage, right? Because now firms located outside the US are legally prohibited or are restricted. They have a cost disadvantage, which makes it more difficult for them to compete with US producers. So a lot of things that are not explicitly monopoly granting privilege actually have the effect of reducing competition through state intervention, the same way that a patent or an exclusive license or charter would do. Okay, so what then should we, what does all this imply about what sort of policy towards monopoly there ought to be? Well, sort of among mainstream economists, there tends to be a view highlighted by the pictures that I showed you before, that that because real world markets are not like the perfectly competitive market that we think is some sort of welfare benchmark or ideal, according to these thinkers, the role of the government is to somehow fix that problem or force actual markets to be more like these hypothetical, imaginary, perfectly competitive markets. If you've heard your professor use the term market failure, right, monopoly or monopoly power is supposed to be a primary example of market failure, and the job of the state in this view is to remedy the failure, right, to undo the market failure, through antitrust, through regulation, restricting, not allowing two firms to merge to become a bigger firm, forcing Amazon, for example, to spin off its web hosting services from its retail services, retail trade, and spinning off Amazon Prime or whatever, right? So breaking up diversified firms into smaller units would be another example. But what is underlying all this is a view of the world that used to be called and should still be called the structure, conduct, performance paradigm, which is essentially the view in competition policy and competition theory that the structure of the market, the number of firms competing, the market share of the biggest firms and so forth, determines the conduct of the market, whether those firms will charge competitive prices or these bad monopoly prices, and therefore that conduct determines the performance of the market from society's point of view. So a market with, you have a small number of big firms with price-setting power, monopoly power, leads to higher prices and lower quantities, which leads to a loss in efficiency and welfare, and therefore the state should start by changing the structure, breaking up big firms and forcing, somehow reducing entry barriers, getting more small firms to enter the market, whatever. The state could also try to impact the conduct with like price controls, setting a maximum price or something and not letting the monopolist, not letting the firm with monopoly power charge a higher price. Again, it's sort of funny. I mean, this view in competition policy really emerged in the 1930s and became entrenched in the 1950s. And then it sort of got displaced by more sophisticated and theoretical models, because it's not very sophisticated at all, right? And so game theory and computational models and fancy dynamic mathematical models were supposed to, at least I was told, sort of move us beyond this old structure, conduct, performance thinking. But now it's back with a vengeance. The current generation of antitrust officials in the US and in Europe are really deeply wedded to this paradigm, which means basically all they do is look at market shares, concentration measures. That, okay, if this industry has it's too highly concentrated, the biggest firms have more than X% of the market, therefore we need to break up, regulate, control, fix, because that's the wrong sort of market structure. I mean, even within the mainstream in the 1970s, 1980s, there were a lot of critiques of this view. The transaction cost critique associated with Oliver Williamson argued that there were, even within that paradigm, there are cost efficiencies from concentration that would have to be balanced against the purported harms in terms of higher prices and reduced consumer welfare. Chicago and UCLA economists pointed out that, well, look, large market share is typically the result of superior performance. It's not that firms have profits because they have a big market share. It's that firms that are good, that sell better products that consumers like, that have lower costs, are more efficient, become profitable, and they gain market share at the expense of firms that are less profitable, suggesting that the structure, conduct, performance model has the causation going the wrong way. So about in the last 5-10 years, there's sort of new movement, which is really a return to the old structure, conduct, performance movement. Sometimes goes under the name hipster antitrust or neo-Brandeisian antitrust after their hero, the legal theorist Louis Brandeis. The current head of the FTC antitrust division, Lena Khan, is the most well-known spokesperson for this particular view of antitrust. And again, it's a very simplistic, the purpose of competition policy, the role of the state is to break up monopolies. And monopoly means market share bigger than X, where X is the number that's convenient for whatever we're trying to do at the time. And so there's a lot of discussion recently about, is it really legit to do that? Is it okay to just, how do you measure the market share? I mean, there's different sort of what they call concentration ratios. The CR4 is the combined market share of the 4 largest firms. Okay, why not the CR5 or the CR10 or the CR1? There's what they call the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is another way of computing the degree of concentration in a market. And there's a lot of discussion just in the last year or so, people trying to study the historical relationship between concentration as measured by these different kinds of measures and the prices that are charged, to try to show that prices are going up because concentration is going up, rather than monetary policy, as the Austrians would say. But it's really hard to identify any kind of causal relationship between concentration measures and prices for the reasons that we've mentioned. Also, I want to remind you, remember that in the Austrian understanding of production, the Austrian understanding of entrepreneurship, the Austrian understanding of profit and loss, you hear a lot in this mainstream literature about the profit rate. The profit rate in this industry is 4%, and we think that's too high, it should be 3%. Well, remember, profit is not a rate. I mean, profit is an amount. It's total revenues minus total costs. And just because on average from 1985 to 2005 in the auto industry, the average profit level among all firms over all years was X dollars, and then we divide that by total sales or total capital invested to turn it into a percentage. I mean, that has nothing to do with what the profitability of a particular firm will be today, right? That's an average over time and over a lot of different firms. Firms earn high profits in one period, and then they earn losses in another period. There's uncertainty, as we mentioned before. The whole concept of a profit rate really doesn't make any sense. The last thing I'll mention, just in the minute or two we have left, is there's another way that this conversation is coming into current debates is with the concerns about so-called monopsony. So monopsony is like monopoly, but on the input side rather than the output side. So a firm with monopsony power, so-called, is a firm that has market power like in the market for procuring inputs, in particular labor. So, for years economists said the minimum wage is not a good way to reduce unemployment. Your professor may have shown you a diagram like this, that if the government sets a legal minimum wage above the wage that clears the market, this just means the quantity supplied of labor, people wanting to work, exceeds the quantity demanded for labor, and we have this amount of surplus labor, i.e. unemployment. And therefore, price controls, wage controls are not a good way to increase wages for the majority of workers. How many of you have seen a picture like this in class before? So now the argument has shifted to where advocates of the minimum wage say, well, yeah, but this assumes that the labor market is perfectly competitive. What if it's not? What if there are a few big firms? What if there's a Walmart in town that employs all the workers and therefore can pay them whatever wages it wants? Doesn't have to pay equal to their discounted marginal revenue product like we were discussing yesterday. So, I mean, this is sort of like the inverse of the monopoly diagram where you have a firm, let's say this firm is the only buyer of labor, only renter of labor in a given town, then here's the market supply of labor, here's the marginal revenue product of labor, so the equilibrium in a competitive market should be this many workers are hired and they get this wage, but because this firm has market power in hiring labor, it has this sort of marginal cost of hiring curve, which is above and to the left of the supply curve for labor. So it actually only hires this many workers, it only pays them this much. So workers are not getting their full discounted marginal revenue product, according to this critique, because the hirers can do whatever they want in the market. Okay? So this is the argument you hear in 2022 for minimum wages. A lot of problems with it. I mean, the same arguments that Rothbard and others levied against monopoly would also apply for monopsony. But I mean, also, look, if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, even in a small town like Auburn, McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, they're all paying more than the state minimum legal wage. They can't hire enough workers. Right? I mean, even if there's an Amazon distribution center in your town, it doesn't employ 95% of all of the workers, especially entry-level low-wage work, which is highly substitutable. It's just hard to imagine that monopsony power could actually play much of a role in wage determination, if you really sort of think about it. Okay, so to summarize, we understand, it's better to understand competition, or I should say Austrians understand competition as a process of rivalry among entrepreneurs who are free to compete in the classical sense of competition. Now, that could result in a few large firms or a lot of small firms. It could result in firms that earn a lot of profits or firms that earn a lot of losses. There could be a lot of entry or not very much entry. There could be a lot of innovation. There could be very little innovation. Ex ante, we can't specify exactly what the behavior or what the outcome would be in that market, only to say that this is the result of free and voluntary interaction among entrepreneurs, capitalists, factor owners, consumers, and so on. So the best government policy from that point of view for restricting monopoly power is don't grant monopolies. Okay, don't give out special privilege, don't restrict trade to give firms a form of monopoly privilege. Step aside, let entrepreneurs compete in the market, and we'll get the best outcomes that we can potentially get. Thank you. Sorry, Connor. No Q&A.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. I'm going to be lecturing this afternoon on the minimum wage. And this lecture is meant to sort of illustrate what can be done with Austrian economics, the method that you've been exposed to so far this week. And I've taught it several times in the past. It's been taught, I think, virtually every year of Mises University, and there's a lot of great lecture content. But one of the things I felt is that I kept on getting drawn down further and further into the weeds of the debate and these paid-for studies for all of the local increases in the minimum wage or state increases in the minimum wage. You know that there's been a lot of increases locally and by various states in recent years, even though the federal minimum wage hasn't been moved in like 13 years. So we have made a little bit of progress, but not very much. And I think in much the same way that my lecture over time has been drawn further and further down into these weeds of these local debates, I think the American public has been dragged down in terms of their understanding. And so what I want to do this year and this afternoon is to go back to the very beginning and to look at what was the reason for the minimum wage law, what was its purpose originally, and why it was so very successful. Okay, when you look at the situation, you look at the history, I would have to admit that the people who first advocated the minimum wage and why they advocated it have been very, very successful in pursuing their own political goals. Okay, so it's going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to completely dump the basic analysis or the more nuanced Austrian analysis of the minimum wage, but we do want to have some insight as to what the whole purpose of this exercise is. And when I say the American public seems to be kind of bamboozled about all of this, and they certainly are, 90% of Americans believe that the minimum wage, in contrast to what I've been talking about for years and years, they believe that the minimum wage should be increased. A majority of Americans think it should be increased to at least $15 an hour. Now, of course, if you set them aside and you ask them, well, if $15 an hour is a good thing, then maybe $80 an hour would be a great thing. Now, first of all, the minimum wage is obviously a political and legalistic phenomenon, and it's always been about regulating labor in the pursuit of the goals of those who are in power. Those who are in political power have used labor legislation and minimum wages for their own benefit. The first attempt at regulating wages was not to establish a minimum, but to establish a maximum wage rate in England after the Black Death of the 13th and 14th century. The king and the nobility wanted to have a maximum wage rate in the overall economy because so many workers died off that the market value of their wages was rising, and it was taking all of the revenues of the landowners and the nobility as a result. In the classical period, John Stuart Mill, who is known in here at least for his methodical inconsistency on matters, would talk about, how labor and wages are a market phenomenon, but then he introduced the exception to the rule due to the power of the factory owners that collective bargaining might be a remedy for at least England and its factories. Now, of course, lost in this period is the fact that Western civilization in Europe, England, France, Germany, and elsewhere first developed and flourished really for the first time once we get into the Industrial Revolution without any kind of real minimum wage laws economy-wide. So they certainly weren't necessary, they weren't viewed as a good thing for developing economies. And even in modern times, we can look at different political areas, cities, regions, states, and we can tell that economic growth and economic development are much better in areas where there are no minimum wages or very low minimum wages. New Zealand and Austria in the 19th century used minimum wages, but that was more of an attempt to advertise, to get new workers to migrate to places like Australia and New Zealand. They had plenty of land, they had plenty of opportunities, but they had very little labor, and they couldn't resort to previous attempts at things like slavery and indentured servitude, so they used advertising campaigns like establishing a minimum wage to attract labor. And of course, that doesn't really do much harm to an economy. It's an attempt to sort of reach out to attract new workers. Now, in contrast to that, what we're going to be looking at here today is the minimum wage movement in the United States roughly 100 to 150 years ago. And of course, it culminated about 80 years ago with the first federal minimum wage law. But this is something that was advocated and promoted and established at the local level, at the state level especially, and then only in the 1930s did we get a federal minimum wage law in the United States. And this was part and parcel, or went hand in hand, with the American eugenic movement. Okay, and the minimum wage was a stopgap measure not to encourage labor to come to the United States, but really as a way of keeping more immigrants out of the country. 120, 130 years ago, 100 years ago, one of the crisscross thoughts in the American mind was, hey, we've got this country and we've established a really good economy and we've become a world military power. Boy, we must be great. We must be successful. And success at that time started, the thinking started that it was genetically oriented. Okay, Mendel, Darwin, this genetic idea, survival of the fittest, all of these sort of pseudo-scientific thoughts were entering the American mind and the American academic mind of the time. And so their conclusion was, hey, us white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, we did it. It was us. It was being white. It was being Protestant. It was being, coming from immigrants and, building this great country. And so they wanted to exclude everybody else. They wanted to create sort of a utopian version, their version of utopia here on Earth. And their minimum wage, along with immigration restrictions and other restrictions and requirements, were designed to hopefully keep all of these new people, colors, and so forth, countries, didn't speak our language, keep them all out. So that's what we're going to be looking at here today. And what we're, in my mind at least, what we're going to find is that there are no clear basis at all in economics or ethics, matters of efficiency, matters of fairness, that support the idea of a minimum wage law. And in fact, in all of these criteria, basically, they fail. Now, Murray Rothbard and other Austrian economists have written about this subject. It's interesting, and we'll see why. Murray wrote about this minimum wage not a whole lot. Even in his book on the progressive era, the minimum wage is but one of many things that the progressives were up to in molding their view of what America should look like. But he has a short little section on minimum wage laws and unions. So that's an important thing. Even if you don't know what that means right now, it's important. Now, in the current American debate, we sort of have divided ourselves into two categories. On the one side is the pro-minimum wage side of the debate, where we need a minimum wage, we need to increase it, we need to expand the minimum wage for matters of survival, matters of equity, and matters of fairness especially. And again, like I said, 90% of Americans agree that there needs to be some increase in the federal minimum wage law. And then, more to my point when I talk later in the week about inequality, is the fact that currently the perception is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Now, you're going to get several doses, including probably right after my lecture, to the fact that labor is really not doing as poorly as people believe, and in my lecture that income inequality is not correctly presented to the American people. So the one side is very much for increases in the minimum wage, and the other side says no, the minimum wage, it only creates unemployment, and it allows for discrimination in the workforce. And we'll see why discrimination becomes a big problem. Now, the Austrians agree with this second group that the minimum wage does increase unemployment, but what I'm going to try to show in here today is that the types of problems that you see in these empirical studies in Washington or San Francisco or San Jose, where the numbers seem trivial, sort of cloud over a much bigger problem than most people realize. And what they fail to realize is that legislation cannot increase overall pay and overall benefits in an economy. It can really only distort and destroy markets. It can only distort and destroy jobs and employers. So we'll go back to the drawing board here quickly. Now, the minimum wage, most of this I've already mentioned. It's a law that sets a floor, a minimum wage in the economy, and you can pay higher wages, of course, but not lower wages, except with some legal exceptions. And currently, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, and it's been that way for over 12 years. When I was born, the minimum wage was $1 an hour. Tells you how freaking old I am. And my last minimum wage job was, I think, $3.45 an hour. And I thought that was great. It was a great job at a great wage. Again, portraying how old I am, but I didn't have to do much work. So it was like a make work job. And so I was very happy to get it. Increases in the minimum wage have been widespread during this period of agitation, political agitation from the media, from academia, and political rights groups, even demonstrations for higher minimum wages. You've probably all seen the sign carrying activity where $15, promoting the idea of a $15 an hour job is a fair wage. And then, of course, cities have increased their minimum wage. I think in Washington, D.C., the minimum wage now is $16.10, which seems pretty high, except you can't afford any place to live there. So it's kind of a mirage of a job. Now here's the conventional economic analysis on a graph. This is a highly exaggerated graph. It really only refers to a small sliver of the overall labor market in an economy, basically the unskilled or very low-skilled jobs in the economy. And it starts with an equilibrium between supply and demand here in the center of the supply and demand curve, which tells us the equilibrium wage and the equilibrium quantity of labor, jobs. And so at that equilibrium wage, there's an equilibrium quantity of jobs given and taken, and so that market is in equilibrium in the free market. It's sort of harmonious in that anybody who wants a job at that equilibrium wage can get a job. So there's no conflict, there's nobody being kept out, there's no unemployment in the marketplace. Now, the minimum wage up here is a legal barrier. Wages cannot go below this bare minimum represented by the minimum wage over here, and on the horizontal axis, the quantity supplied increases from equilibrium. In other words, this higher minimum wage has brought more people into the labor force, but it's also destroyed jobs. Okay, so this area along here is the unemployment caused by the minimum wage. Now, of course, this is an exaggeration. Typically, the minimum wage is not much higher than the equilibrium wage, and the amount of unemployment, especially when you look at compare it to the overall labor market, is relatively small in terms of numbers. The percentage of our workforce currently working a minimum wage job as of a couple of years ago was less than 2% of the overall labor market. So this is an exaggeration for visual effect right here, but it's just meant to convey the conventional economic wisdom concerning the minimum wage. So even amongst professional economists, you can get very different views on the minimum wage. If we walked over to the economics department at Auburn, you'd probably find, a few people who were against the minimum wage and a few people who wanted to have $15 an hour minimum wage. We don't even have a minimum wage in the state of Alabama. None. Yeah. And actually, several of the southern states don't have minimum wage laws. And that should also tell you something, or it will tell you something about the minimum wage. So, and then in between, I'm sure you'd find some people over there who would say, well, yes, I want to increase it, but I want to have, you know, a subcategory, and I want to have some wages, subsidies for this group, and, you know, training for other groups. And, the technocratic mind of mainstream economists would go into overdrive, and you'd see a little smoke coming out of their ears by the time you got done talking to them. So there's all sorts of people, and if I had money to dole out to all of these people, I'm sure I could come up with 1,000 people on one side and 1,000 people on another, professional economists, who would give us basically the two views. And on the one hand, when asked what would the minimum wage do, you might hear something like, well, there's just no evidence that raising the minimum wage costs jobs. At least when the starting point is as low as it is in modern America. This apparent defiance of the laws of supply and demand occurs because, quote, the market for labor isn't like the market for, say, wheat, because workers are people. Now, on the other hand, let's try that, okay. Quote, any Econ 101 students can tell you the answer. The higher wage reduces the quantity of labor demanded and hence leads to unemployment. Clearly, these advocates of the minimum wage law very much want to believe that the price of labor, unlike that of things like gasoline or Manhattan apartments, can be set based on considerations of justice, not supply and demand, without any side effects. And so I said, you can find 1,000 economists on one side and 1,000 economists on the other. So who said these things? That's Paul Krugman. And that's Paul Krugman. Poor Paul, he said so much that he's just a constant target, especially of Bob Murphy. So that's the sort of current state, and Austrians find this current state of the debate very disappointing, with one side saying minimum wage laws are necessary and critical, and the other side saying no, it just causes unemployment and discrimination. But hidden in this debate are at least 3 critical Austrian criticisms of this technocratic, in this case, progressive mindset, and the mindset of economists and particularly statisticians. First of all, the U.S. debate is in terms of short-run analysis. They're only really concerned about the short run. What would the impact be in the short run? And they never, as far as I can tell, they've never gone back and say, well, what has this done over the long run? Second of all, it's wage rate analysis only. Labor is a contract between employer and employer, and wages is the most important thing, but it's not the only thing that a job involves, either for the employee or the employer. And third, it's statistical analysis, and this has some inherent weaknesses in terms of being informative, especially when you combine it with only a short-run analysis and only a wage and unemployment analysis. They're missing the general points that Frederick Bastiat, Henry Hazlitt, and so many other Austrians have made, that you don't want to look at just the direct short-run effects of a piece of legislation. You don't want to look at just the beneficiary of a piece of legislation, but you want to look at the impact on everybody in an economy, and you want to look at that impact over the long run. So it misses the entire picture of Austrian emphasis, and it misses the whole idea that a job is more than just a wage, and it misses the market process analysis of Austrian economics. And what I'm advocating here is that only the Austrian analysis provides a clear, correct method and theory that is consistent with the facts and provides a global understanding of the issue. Now, in terms of where this came from, well, it developed among progressive thinkers, and progressive thinkers were believers in eugenics. Eugenics, quoting from the slide, during the early 1900s was also known as American Mendelism eugenics or mainline eugenics, and it was a mix of scientific and pseudoscientific studies and beliefs popularizing the rediscovery of the work of Mendel and Darwin. Eugenical programs such as immigration restriction focused either on the elimination or fostering of heritable traits. So if we can keep out, immigrants from this country or that country, we won't be injecting all of their inferior genetic traits, and we'll be strengthening the genetic gene pool that already exists. We won't be watering it down, I think was a phrase they used quite a bit. Many of these people believed in compulsory sterilization as a way to effectively get rid of the inferior populations who already exist. So they were for immigration restrictions, preventing people from coming in. For those inferiors who already got in, they advocated compulsory sterilization and what's called institutionalization. And I'm still not perfectly sure what that means, but it's part welfare, part racial colonies, and institutionalization of the insane, the criminal, all that sort of stuff. So prisons of various sorts for this invalid population. And I'm taking a lot of this stuff, not from Rothbard, but from a guy, Thomas Leonard, who published a book called Illiberal Reformers, Race, Eugenics, and American Economics in the Progressive Era, which is roughly 1900 to 1920 into the 30s. And it involved all of the main top thinkers in American economics, but also sociology and history and government, the bureaucrats. They all basically believed in this progressive approach to economic policy that should be racially based. And eugenics, this pseudoscientific idea of eugenics was a major part of progressivism, and of course it was also of Nazism in Germany. And it was a central tenet of American economists. So they would frame all of their economic policy into its conventional effects, but also, would this advantage or disadvantage the long-standing domestic population, or would it disadvantage or advantage the weaker new people coming into the economy. So it was central. The American Economic Association, Leonard quotes and references several presidents of the American Economic Association in his book about the fact of connecting the minimum wage to racial policy of discrimination. And he says that this is the exact opposite of liberalism. There weren't a lot of liberals left in academia even back then, but liberalism as Austrians know it, classical liberalism, primarily because it was racist and it was sexist, and it didn't make much economic or scientific sense either. And progressivism, you know, nowadays if you're a progressive, that means you're a modern American liberal to the extreme. But in actual fact, the progressive movement was kind of a conservative, fascist type of movement. So they wanted to conserve the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nature of America. And so it's not necessarily modern American conservatism, but they did want to conserve and promote this this whiteness and this Protestant Anglo-Saxon background in America. So it doesn't even really hold up to dictionary definitions of what we think of progressivism today. It was, unless the progressives can be identified clearly as socialist and fascist, which you can do, but progressivism is not what a lot of people think. And it's not scientific, even though it was done by scientists, but rather a normative and incorrect scientific view. It really didn't hold sway with Mendel's work, Darwin's work. It was not really survival of the fittest, even as I understand it, and I'm not a scientist. It was just a giant crackpot theory of what those people wanted at that time. In fact, liberals, again, as Austrians understand it, celebrate the benefits of diversity and inequality. And I'll take a look at that in my next lecture. So they began with immigration restrictions. President Teddy Roosevelt claimed that immigration into the country was race suicide. And of course, there was a big wave of Irish and then Italian, Eastern Europeans, and so forth in the 19th century and early 20th century until they shut the door. But it was, in their mind, it was race suicide to allow these people into the country. It was the greatest problem of the civilization as Roosevelt understood it. And it's all based on very dubious reasoning. They wanted immigration restrictions based on race. Ultimately, they got based on nations without much rhyme or reason. Anglo-Saxons and Germans were allowed in because of their purity, even though historically, you know, those were highly mixed peoples in the area of generally northern Europe and England. And they even defined the Irish people as alpine people. And I haven't done extensive explorations of the Irish island, but I do believe that the Alps mountains do not cross the English Channel and then the Irish Sea and onto Ireland. So, and their ideas about skull science, which they thought was great. You know, the head's got to be big and it's got to be nice. It's got to be like all of our other heads and faces. And if you didn't have a big head or your face looked different, that was a sign that we didn't want you. But of course, that was shown to be scientific nonsense. And I just put Edward Atkinson and David Wells here because there were so few people in my reading who turned out to be good guys that I thought I'd put them in my notes so I can go back and read more about them. So the immigration restrictions were enacted, but they didn't really do the job. They shut the door of immigration after the fact, so the horse had already gotten into the barn or something, and before they shut the door, so they were left with all of these people that they didn't want. So the minimum wage was the next best solution. It replaced immigration restrictions and literacy tests, but it allowed discrimination in the American workforce. So if you had a high minimum wage, you had, like on the graph, you had more people applying than jobs that you had available. So you could pick and choose who you wanted for the job. Okay, that surplus unemployment was allowed employers to pick and choose. So they could pick white men for the jobs, and they would, by discrimination, exclude blacks, minorities, funny-looking foreigners, women, children, so on and so forth. And so progressives viewed it as helping the race and removing they called these people invalids as a general category. And the minimum wage would help deter migration and detect the unproductive. Unproductive meaning racially or genetically unproductive. So this was good for the racial health of the country, and all of the progressives and all of the leaders of the American Economic Association agreed. And this also helped them discriminate against women, to keep women out of the workforce, because women were in the workforce. They were 45%. Oh. They were 45% of the professional workforce. And so they were definitely in the workforce before any of this happened. And the progressives wanted them out. They wanted women in the home procreating the race. They didn't want them being bound up with a job. So they enacted maximum hours, they invoked minimum wages, and even stipends for unmarried women with children to keep these women, these pesky women, out of the workforce. Richard T. Ely said there should be no night work or jobs for women because it was injurious to the female organism. Interesting way to put that. But the idea was to protect white male jobs from women, from children, and from particular immigrant groups like the Chinese. By setting wages higher than equilibrium levels, they allowed employers who were almost all white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to pick people that looked the same as they did. So there was this mothers of the race argument that we had to keep women in the home. And I was going to read this quote by Ross on page 179 of Leonard's book, but I decided I couldn't do that. So when Austrians look at progressives, they don't understand the issue and that the current debate focusing on short-term, wage-only, and statistics disguises the issue, doesn't really look at discrimination. And we look at the long run discrimination, we find the unemployment rate over this long period of time was the worst ever during this 50 years was 10%. The best ever was 2.5%. That includes blacks and minorities. If you look at the black labor force, the worst unemployment was 20%, twice the overall. And if you look at black teen unemployment, the worst period was 50%, more than twice the black population, black labor force, excuse me. So clearly what we're seeing if we isolate the black labor force is much higher rates of unemployment due to discrimination because of minimum wage laws and other labor regulations in the economy. So that's the long run effect, systematic and powerfully painful to minorities. Minimum wage effects in the longer run. This study found that minimum wages when you were young had continuing negative effects as that cohort of labor worked its way through its lifespan. So if you were disadvantaged or discriminated against because of the minimum wage early in your life, in your teens, that would have a carryover negative effect throughout the rest of your career. You weren't likely to reach managerial levels within the firm, for example, until much, much later, if at all. And this study pinpoints that effect, that longer term effect, stronger for blacks on the minimum wage. And these negative effects are more significant than the contemporaneous effect on youth that are the focus of much of the policy debate. So it has a long run effect. So just because you're disadvantaged as a teenager, it does mean the disadvantage lasts over time. So Austrians are going to be looking at a lot of different things with respect to the jobs, and you know that there's more things related to the jobs, vacation and sick days, which I'll come back to. But there's also the basic idea that these studies are looking at cities, a type of industry like restaurants, and they're looking at unemployment, employment over the very short run. There's just a lot more factors that can come into play that are going to give you the wrong results because of your narrow focus. So, you know, the famous study in 1994 that said an increase in the minimum wage can increase restaurant jobs was seriously flawed in its basic approach. But it's been cited 1,000 million times, and it's still an argument today. Okay, and a higher minimum wage can actually lead to lower compensation. There was a study done and published in the Harvard Business Review that looked at a chain of fashion stores in California and Texas. In California, the minimum wage was going up, and in Texas, it stayed the same. And so what they found is every dollar increase in the minimum wage in California led to lower overall compensation. So there were more workers, employment went up, but all the workers on average had fewer hours. So their checks, their monetary compensation actually went down as a result of increases in the minimum wage by 14% for every dollar increase in California. And they went on to look at workers who got 20 hours or more. 20 hours or more before the increase and 20 hours or more after the increase. And they found that the people who had 20 hours or more, that number fell by 23%. And as a result, they lost all of their retirement benefits, which don't get included in the wage, but can come and go according to the employer. If the employer needs to attract workers, they offer more benefits. But in response to the minimum wage increase, they offered less. And with 30 hours or more, they saw a 15% decrease in that worker population. And that, if you went below 30 hours a week, you lost your health care benefits. So the monetary reward fell by over 20%. And then some workers in this larger pool actually lost their retirement benefits and lost their health care benefits as a result. So that almost all of the payments that employers had to make were offset by all of these compensation changes. And then they also had to work more shifts for shorter hours, and the shifts were more variable, and it made it very, very difficult for new mothers and people with other obligations to maintain their jobs. So job tenure at this company went right down the toilet. So the big picture is the progressives wanted this minimum wage law, and it was fairly effective in promoting discrimination against disadvantaged groups, particularly immigrants, particularly minorities, blacks, Hispanics, and so forth in the economy, and that those populations have been disproportionately institutionalized in things like welfare. The percentage of black population who is on welfare at any one time or on welfare at any point in their life is 3 times higher than the white population. The population of black Americans who have been incarcerated in prison or who are incarcerated in prison now is up to 10 times higher than the white population. And of course, that greatly diminishes your ability to prosper in the marketplace if you've been quote unquote institutionalized as a result of these laws in the government and what they've been intending to do. Their intentions may not be the same anymore, and not everybody has those intentions, but that was the original intent. And I think we need to know that and realize that and exploit that because Austrians view these things as completely unnecessary. They're only distortive, they're only harmful, and that the free market eliminates unemployment with the exception of frictional unemployment, which means you're quitting your job to go get a better job, and we're perfectly okay with that. Thank you very much. Sorry, I ran a little bit over.
I'm Gene Epstein. I figure since it's 4 o'clock, I might as well start. I gather this is will be one of those lectures that you won't have to know for the final exam, but I hope you find it interesting. The best way I have of introducing myself is to mention to you that I did notice that downstairs there is a Mises Institute book for sale called Economic Controversies, and it consists of more than 50 essays by the late, great Murray Rothbard. It includes an introduction, and the first sentence of that introduction reads, "It was nearly 40 years ago that Murray Rothbard changed my life." Now, that introduction is written by me. I was, in fact, asked by a rep of the Mises Institute about 10 years ago if I would contribute an introduction to that book, and of course, I was greatly honored to do so. You can imagine if he changed my life nearly 40 years ago. That's, of course, by now nearly 50 years ago. The only thing I can clarify is that while I did meet Murray Rothbard briefly a couple of times, he changed my life through his books. And the nearly 40 years ago occurrence was that I picked up a copy of Man, Economy, and State. And that was my first exposure to Austrian economics, my first exposure to the writings of Murray Rothbard. And then because that was the early 70s, there was no Mises Institute for me to attend. Nothing like the wonderful series of lectures and courses you're taking now. But luckily, there was a bricks and mortar bookshop in downtown Manhattan called the Laissez-Faire Bookshop. I visited it virtually every weekend and browsed and bought a couple of copies of books there and read through Rothbard, Mises, Hayek, Hazlitt, the whole slew of people. So I became typically sort of one of those self-taught in Austrian economics. And I'm very grateful for that, and that hopefully will allow you to appreciate the fact that my roots are in this place, at the Mises Institute. The last I was here was about 10 years ago delivering a talk, and I do have to say that the place is even better than it was before. I don't know whether to give that credit to Jeff Deist. More than likely, what's really happened is that a whole generation of people have grown up with Austrian economics, and that's why you've been having such a rich assortment of lectures from so many brilliant people. I've been sitting here all day enjoying them. Unfortunately, I've got to go back to New York City tomorrow, but would love to have stayed another couple of days and listened to all these wonderful talks. Well, I'm going to build on them, I hope, a little bit, and say further only that I had a kind of an odd career. I left the academy and went to Wall Street, but then I spent more than a quarter of a century covering the data for Barron's Financial Weekly, doing a column, and in fact, I was book review editor, and I was privileged to invite a few Mises people to write book reviews for Barron's. But I covered the data. That was my job. And I wrote a book called Econo-Spinning. It was published in 2006, How to Read Between the Lines When the Media Manipulate the Numbers. That's still in print. Another book that I think is really good on the data is Bob Murphy's book, Contra Krugman. Bob is one of those Austrian economists who I think certainly knows the data, much of the data, at least as well as I do. And I want to recommend to you that you may want to take a deep dive, read those two books, take a deep dive into government data as much. And indeed, of course, statistics, the root of that word is the state. And indeed, so you're really looking at the sinfulness of government data. It's an interesting question to ask, would there be data? Would there be a market for data if there were only a free market, and if the government weren't involved at all in the economy, which is the way things should be, aside from if there is a government, aside from just enforcing contracts and enforcing other violations of the zero aggression principle. But if there were not only a free market, would there be data? Would there be a market for data? I think there would. I think the data would be better than it is today. I even think there might be price indexes. The only story I guess I could tell on Murray Rothbard, much as I think he was, of course, the man who changed my life, is that he was a little hypocritical about price indexes. In his book Man, Economy, and State, he talks about the impossibility of price indexes, and in a sense, he's right. The difficulty, it's more of an art than a science, and yet I did notice, and I think it's in his writings as well, I did notice that when he was lecturing on economic history, he had no compunction about using price indexes when they became useful. And so that's, in a way, how you might approach economic data. Some of it is useful. And I want to walk you through a story that I call the dirty data of labor compensation myths. I'm emphasizing that story because one of my big concerns as a free market person who came from a left-wing background, shockingly enough, when I was the age of most of you, I was a democratic socialist, having risen from the depravity of being not a card-carrying communist. My mommy was a communist. She was the card-carrying communist. But I was a pretty enthusiastic Stalinist at the age of 7. I outgrew it at the age of 10 or 11, but I outgrew it only by becoming a sort of a democratic socialist. And that's my brief story. But why is it helpful? Well, it's helpful because one of my obsessions is to lecture the left on how capitalism really is on the side of the little guy. That my brief answer to many people who ask me, why are you pro-free market? Why are you a libertarian? I like to say, because I care about the well-being of the broad masses of people. That's why I'm a libertarian. Because when we talk about a lot of sort of rarefied things, many of which are very important, there's this sort of gut level reaction on the part of the left that, oh, well, you're talking about, economics for smart people. You're talking about the economics for the few and not for the many. You innovative, smart people have a lot of fun under capitalism. But how about the ordinary person? How does that person cope under capitalism? Well, I believe that primarily, if you could tote up the benefits and other aspects of free market capitalism, you could sort of subjectively declare that its main attribute is that it brings equality. It lifts the living standards of the broad masses of people. That's really its principal magic. And that, I think, is a message that we should tell to them in all kinds of possible ways that we can. But my concern, as somebody who knows the numbers, has been that there's been a resurgence of this idea that labor is getting shafted. Now, I happen to believe that labor is getting shafted by government. A couple of those ways have been mentioned already by the previous speakers, but two that I would mention very briefly is the rise of restrictive licensure. I'm all for certifying lawyers, but I don't believe in restrictive licensure. I believe that most of us could practice real estate and divorce law. If we worked for a law firm for a few months, we'd learn the ropes. We don't have to go to college and law school to do it. But even more perniciously, about 5% of jobs were under a restrictive licensure of one sort or another about 50 years ago, and now it's up to about 25%. Now, I believe that what that does is it really does inhibit the mobility of labor, because we're talking about, of course, the focus is usually on being a manicurist, being an assistant to a funeral director, the kind of jobs that ordinary people can get, much more difficult to get, much more costly to acquire, because you have to meet all kinds of state requirements. The other one, more subtly, which the progressives miss, is the weird fact that so much migration goes to areas of the country where housing is cheap. That's not where the high-paying jobs are, but that's where the housing is cheap. And where the housing is cheap is where government is usually less involved in the housing market. But in the high-wage areas, San Francisco, New York City, Los Angeles, in the high-wage areas, housing is prohibitively expensive, and this especially shafts people of limited means, ordinary workers. And I do think that you find from the official numbers some gap inequality, widening inequality of wages between the higher paid and the lower paid. And I think that those two factors have a lot to do with it, both of them having to do with government intervention in the marketplace. So that's the best way those progressives can help equality. But by and large, there hasn't been that much change in the way that labor is paid in the aggregate. And I want to walk you through a few myths about it and try to expose them and explain how they work. Well, I'm calling it the dirty data of labor compensation myths. I'll start with a quote from the press secretary for Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. That's Brianna Gray. Joy Gray, she said to him, the share that goes to laborers has gotten less and less and less. What else does she say? While corporate profits have soared, the share of national income that goes to labor has declined, and it's near its lowest point in almost 70 years. That's a government working paper. And then this is even the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, mentions significant declines in the labor share of income, and he thinks that the remedy should be worker representation on corporate boards. The Cato Institute is, of course, a libertarian think tank, and the ghost of Karl Marx is what David Henderson refers to. David Henderson is a very good free market economist, and yet he's written an essay called The Decline in Labor Share of Income, and then in a course he taught, he told the students that although I'm no Marxist, I did find this a little concerning. Well, I'm going to mention some really established academicians who've written peer-reviewed papers who push the same story. Labor is getting shafted. I'm going to explain what they say and why it is a violation of Econ 101. But I want to start with something that we see on Twitter a lot, and I'll walk you through the chart. You see it on Twitter, you see it from the Economic Policy Institute, left-wing institutes, and it really has not been challenged. This is the official story. The red line tracks the real output per hour of all persons. That's inflation adjusted, and this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, directly from them. And the blue line tracks real compensation per hour. That too is inflation adjusted. The outrageous fact is that from late 1940s to the early 1970s, the two tracked each other. But then real compensation per hour greatly lagged real output per hour of all persons. You can see the red line rising, the blue line lagging. And I will tell you, the funny thing is that I've seen a number of free market people who connect this with Nixon's lifting of the gold window, closing the gold window, I should say. That in the early 70s, up until the early 70s, the Bretton Woods Agreement obligated the U.S. government to redeem in gold any foreigners holding dollars, and then Nixon abrogated that. Now, that might have caused a lot of problems, but what's interesting is that I've seen libertarians swear by this chart and declare that it's all because Nixon closed the gold window. So nobody doubts that it must be true. After all, it's in both those theories are inflation adjusted, and they both come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And look at what happened. Suddenly, labor was not being paid its output per hour in real terms. Well, now let me tell the unofficial story. The red line tracks output per hour of all persons in nominal dollars, and is that the red line? Yeah, the red line. Yeah, and the blue line tracks compensation per hour in nominal dollars. Now, that's also from your Bureau of Labor Statistics. What have I done? Very little. All I did was take out the inflation adjustment from both of those series. All I did was restore them to nominal dollars. No longer inflation adjusted, just how did they fare in nominal dollars? Now, maybe you don't have to be an Austrian to recognize that business sells its goods and values its goods in nominal dollars. Business pays its wages in nominal dollars. And indeed, as any sort of macroeconomist worth his salt would say, a nominal versus a nominal equals a real. Nominal divided by nominal equals a real. You're lining up nominal dollars year by year by year, and they are in real terms reflect each other. And again, to repeat, wages are paid in nominal dollars, output is sold in nominal dollars, and suddenly those two lines are tracking each other. If you calculate them in terms of percentage rises, you'll find that since the 1970s, the percentage rise of labor compensation in nominal dollars has tracked the percentage rise of labor output in nominal dollars. So that's all I did. And when I ran this chart a couple of times on Twitter, it looked like I was some kind of liar or a magician. They were left-wingers who decided to block me from now on. How could I possibly do such an outrageous thing as to take away their candy, what they seemingly believed? Well, now, what is the story behind this? Why do you get the two tracking each other if you simply take out the inflation adjustment from both series? What you find is that these numbers have been kept, so to speak, according to two sets of books. The labor compensation number has been deflated by this consumer price index that the BLS also publishes, Bureau of Labor Statistics. The non-farm business sector output has been deflated by something called the implicit price deflator. And you find that up until the early 1970s, those two price indexes were approximately tracking each other. But then you find that the CPI took off and the implicit price deflator remained relatively sluggish. And as you may know, in order to inflation adjust a number, you divide that number, compensation, by the CPI. You divide output by the implicit price deflator. And so it's all in the fact that, which might be a story in itself if you believe these price indexes, that something happened to the prices that were charged for consumer goods, and something else happened to the value in real terms of the output of industry. All of that is interesting, potentially. But if you're going to make a point about labor being shafted, about how labor is not being paid according to its productivity, isn't it much simpler to line up the nominal dollars with the nominal dollars and then see what you get? Again, because goods are sold in nominal dollars and people are paid in nominal dollars. So again, this is something. I will guarantee you that if you troll through left-wing, left-oriented tweets, you're going to find this chart, a chart like this, repeated over and over again. It's a rock-ribbed fact. Labor is getting shafted. It's not being paid. It's productivity. All because of a simple error of measurement that I would submit is pretty palpable. And on the part, by the way, the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't really, the nominal number, I had to tease it out. It's easy enough to get, but it's not really readily accessible, the current dollar numbers. But the inflation adjusted numbers are easily accessible. Now, I should even say, by the way, that one of my confirming sources is a guy who was very high up at the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They put out the national income accounts. One of my advantages as a columnist, of course, is I got to know these people who covered the government numbers. And this guy, he's now a consultant in different respects, and he said, look, it really is a bit of a joke. They think that starting in the early 1970s, labor was not getting its output, the value of its productivity, and it lagged and lagged and lagged. And so why don't they ask themselves, well, where did all that income go? Profits must have gone through the roof. Profits must have tripled and quadrupled, is what the guy honestly says to me. And of course, you don't find that at all in the aggregate. I won't show you those numbers, but you might be curious to know, my God, the exploitation rate has been off the charts, and how could that possibly have happened? Well, it didn't happen. It didn't happen if you look at the nominal numbers. Well, now I want to get into something a little bit more subtle. That really arises from the quote that I began with, and it begins with the idea of a ratio of labor share. I believe it's potentially a legitimate calculation, labor share, as long as you accept the broad aggregate numbers of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which keeps the GDP numbers and keeps the broad macro numbers. Labor share is calculated by first with the numerator being a measure of labor compensation, including benefits. Now, I saw Paul Krugman cite labor compensation excluding benefits. But benefits are pension contributions, benefits are medical care insurance, and obviously if you have a job and they're contributing to your 401k, or if they have you in a regular pension plan, or if they also are paying for your medical insurance, that's something that would be out of pocket. And most people, certainly including Krugman, and certainly including there's another editorial writer at the New York Times who takes out compensation, you'd have to ask them, don't you find benefits are valuable to you? Because if you didn't get these benefits as calculated, then obviously you'd have to spend money out of your wages and salaries on them. So, but most of these calculations, except when Krugman runs them, are a measure of labor compensation, including benefits. But then there's the denominator. The denominator is the measure of income and output, and that's where the problem arises. But now let me get to a quote from, there's something odd, that there is a dissent from one mainstream economist. I began with quotes from different sources, and I'm going to get to some others, saying that labor's share has been declining for the last 20, 30 years. That somehow or other labor used to get a certain share of income, and now it's getting far less. But the interesting thing is that the only dissenting source that I've come across is a assistant chief economist at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which generates the numbers. He's written a paper in which he has concluded that labor share does remain within its historical range. I've written him, I've corresponded with him, but what's very clear is that while he doesn't mind publishing his paper, he also doesn't mind that it doesn't get a lot of attention, because he doesn't want to do battle with so many, I would think, that's my best guess, is that he doesn't really want to contradict so many established sources that look at this decline in labor share and start creating all kinds of crazy ideas about it with respect to, for example, monopsony, which was mentioned in the earlier talk. That there's this huge monopsonistic cartel on the part of the capitalists, and that's why labor share is in the pits. They're building all kinds of theories about it based upon, as I'm about to explain to you, based upon bogus numbers that make the same kind of simple, fallacious mistake that the previous set of numbers also made. Now, what do we mean by historical range? He said historical range, and that the past 75 years since World War II, which is a reasonable cutoff point for reasonable reasons, with quarterly data starting in 1947. That's the historical range, and there's something interesting about that, which I'll get to in a moment. But we're looking at the last 75 years, and that starts in the late 1940s. Well, what do I have here? I'm going to start then with the Wall Street Journal, since that's not a daily newspaper that's known for its hostility toward capitalism, but it did run a major article by this journalist named Peter Kiernan, and he wrote in a piece called, "Despite tight labor market, labor force's income is squeezed. Workers' slice of the pie has been shrinking, confounding economists. Their slice of the pie has been shrinking." And this is the chart that he ran, although I've simplified it a bit. This chart is labor compensation, that's again wages, all of labor, actually includes government labor, all of labor, including wages and salaries, and as well benefits. And I've done it as a 40-quarter moving average in order to smooth out the bumps, and that's a percentage of gross domestic income. Gross domestic income, remember that. And what it shows, and consistent with what he has said, is that labor share was, its 40 quarter or 10-year moving average was, at 53%, and then now it's down to, only 52%. It was rising here, and then it fell, and now I've drawn a red line at 53.02 and showing that it's pretty much at a 75-year low. And that's what he has run. And that's what you find in his Wall Street Journal article. But now, again, notice that the denominator is gross domestic income. Now, we're going to do a little Econ 101. Now notice something else. This is the same data, except the denominator is net domestic income. Labor compensation is a percentage of net domestic income. And it now looks noticeably different. And I'll, of course, explain the difference between gross and net domestic income in a moment, but examine it and now recognize one thing, that labor compensation is now 63.16% of net domestic income, and it's a higher number than any number through 1970. It's equal to or higher than any number through 1970. And what we're going to find by looking at other examples is something really rather odd and somewhat embarrassing to progressives. If you think this is a valid measure, and it is approximately correct, then what is it telling us? It's actually telling us that over the last 10 to 20 years, as conventionally measured, labor compensation as a percentage of net domestic income is about where it was in the 1950s and 1960s, actually a little bit higher. It tells us further that labor compensation into the 70s and 80s, 90s rose and then fell back to the levels of the 50s and 60s. Now, why is this extremely embarrassing to progressives? Because they are constantly telling us that the 1950s and 60s are the decades we've got to return to. That's when unions in the private sector represented about 1/3 of the labor force, and now it's down to 6%. That's when the bogeyman of competition from abroad, cheap labor from abroad, was practically non-existent. That was when they were no longer, and now, of course, they claim that it's the rise of the high-tech firms. That's another reason for it. The high-tech firms didn't exist. All of the factors that they mention that are at fault were not a problem or were working well in the 50s and 60s. And yet, the stark fact is that if you take labor share measures seriously, you find that for some strange reason, when the bad stuff happened in the 80s, Ronald Reagan takes over and breaks the power of the unions, and union and labor unionization goes into a tailspin. And that's when labor compensation is higher. That's when it's rising. Global competition begins in the 80s and into the 90s, and that's when labor compensation is at its highest. The world turns upside down if you track labor compensation according to this measure. Now, I will now want to explain to you why this measure is the valid one. What is the difference between gross domestic income and net domestic income? Well, net domestic income, by the way, is the income side of gross domestic product. It is gross domestic product, except measured on the income side rather than the product side. And net domestic income is simply the difference, it's simply minus depreciation. We were given a lecture on capital theory earlier today, and depreciation was mentioned. And now let me get to the Bureau of Economic Analysis definition of depreciation, because I think it will make sense for Austrians. The Bureau of Economic Analysis in their handbook says that the consumption of fixed capital or depreciation is the charge for the using up of private and government fixed capital located in the United States. It is the decline in the value of the stock of fixed assets due to wear and tear, obsolescence, accidental damage, and aging. Now, let's get to another interesting concept called national income. The Bureau of Economic Analysis defines national income as the sum of all incomes net of the consumption of fixed capital earned in production. Now, what are we really saying? What we're really saying is that any measure of income, if you are going to do macro measures, I know that Austrian's book is, but if you're going to do any kind of measure for any sector, why do you want to subtract the allowance for depreciation? Because if you don't make an allowance for depreciation, as we were told earlier today, the economy will ultimately sink into oblivion. You have to make an allowance to shore up the depreciation of capital. The income that's left after that allowance is the only income that's really available. And interestingly enough, the Bureau of Economic Analysis and conventional measures make an allowance for this by making a distinction between gross and net. Gross domestic product and net domestic product, gross domestic product and net domestic income. Now, again, what I showed you was that if you take net domestic income in your denominator, you're going to get a very different result for labor share. And let me go over that a little bit more. Gross domestic product equals gross domestic income. Net domestic product equals net domestic income. And they are the same measures, although they're measured in different, conceptually they're the same. And then what does the Bureau of Economic Analysis say about net domestic product? It may be viewed as an estimate of sustainable product, which is a rough measure of the level of consumption that can be maintained while leaving capital assets intact. You're leaving capital assets intact because you are making an allowance for the depreciation of capital that you're shoring up. And now, what is the other, why do I get a difference when I put net domestic income into the denominator versus gross domestic income? Something else that's gone on in the US economy, which I think is valid. Depreciation has been taking an increasing bite out of gross domestic income. So that, again, the net result is that here's net domestic income has declined as a share of gross domestic income. Now, why is that? That's because there's been increase in investment in equipment and software as a percentage of private sector capital investment. This is in nominal dollars. And we are looking, in the 50s and 60s, there was an emphasis on the building of structures, and they depreciate very slowly. Over the last 30 years, there's been a huge tilt toward investment in equipment and software. Those are also capital goods, I would maintain, and they depreciate very quickly. And so that is the reason why, if you are going to use an historical measure of labor share, you have to use a net figure rather than a gross figure. Because the net figure is the true measure of the income and product available, and the net figure has declined. So that if you do the math, if the net is lower and lower, then the percentage becomes very different if the numerator rather is the same. Hopefully you grasp that math. Well, what else do I have here to present to you? Well, again, this is the same guy. Actually, his name is Benjamin Bridgman. He says, recent net labor share is within its historical range, whereas gross share is at its lowest level. I removed depreciation since paying for it only returns the economy to the production possibilities of the previous period. Using net production thus only includes output, which can be used for current consumption or expanding future production. But the experts still stick to GDP. Now here is a quote from a peer-reviewed paper from a group of 5 economists with huge prestige, and they write, the fall of labor's share of GDP in the United States and many other countries in recent decades is well documented, but its causes remain uncertain. They then go on to say that it's all because of the rise of superstar firms. They're using gross domestic product as their measure. They are right, it's well documented. But what these superstar economists have apparently missed is that gross domestic product is no longer a continuous measure for labor share to be put into the denominator. And again, that's because of the new nature of investment and the fact that depreciation is taking an increasing bite out of it. I could send them this chart and their whole thesis about superstar firms would fall apart. This is labor compensation as a share of net domestic product. Again, it tells the same story. Take net domestic product rather than gross domestic product, and you're going to get the same result, which is that we are about where we were in the 50s and 60s. So if you're talking about the rise of superstar firms, how comes it that we're doing about as well as we did in the 50s and 60s when there were none of these superstar firms, which of course are Amazon and Google and all these other firms that they clearly think is a problem. Their story falls apart once you use a simple measure. Now, let me see how much time I have. I'll cover one other subtle part of this. This is a narrower measure, and this is for non-financial corporations. The measure of non-financial corporations is actually the best measure to use for corporations, and it's a measure that is run by the Bureau of Labor Statistics as well as the BEA. The Bureau of Labor Statistics will run a measure that looks like this. Labor compensation is a percentage of gross value added. Why do I take non-financial corporations? Because financial corporations used to be about 5% of the corporate sector, and they're now about 13 to 14%. As an Austrian, I happen to think that while there's been some good things reflected in the fact that financial corporations are more important than ever, there's lots of reasons to find that to be a problem. For example, there would be no need for foreign currency trading by financial corporations. It's a big source of revenue if there was simply just one currency in the world rather than all the balkanized currencies. There are lots of reasons to think that these financial corporations are a little bit of a distortion, but they make a higher rate of profit. And we could have a separate listing for them, but what they do is that they distort the number. It's fairly well recognized, but the non-financial corporations that are still about 87% of the corporate sector are still pretty much a good core measure. And indeed, the Bureau of Labor Statistics runs data for them in terms of productivity. They themselves think that it's a good core measure, and they run a labor compensation number. And the difficulty that I have is that anybody who wants to contradict me about what's actually happened to labor compensation can cite directly Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics does not publish any numbers netting out depreciation. And they only publish gross numbers. And so how can I possibly argue with an august organization like them? So what they run is, for example, labor compensation as a percentage of gross value added. That's similar to the gross domestic product of these non-financial corporations, the gross value added of the non-financial corporations. And they do indeed show a precipitous decline in labor share. But then if you take labor compensation as a percentage of net value added, and the only way to get that number, by the way, is to go to the BEA's website, where they have depreciation figures for the for non-financial corporations. And there you find this pretty much the same story. The compensation is now again comparable to what it was in the 50s and 60s. And then you also find, as a matter of fact, Benjamin Bridgman of the BEA does another figure which is kind of interesting. Labor compensation for non-financial corporations as a percentage of net value added minus production taxes. Bridgman points out there are actually taxes that corporations pay that by virtue of producing. This is not corporate income taxes. This is just the taxes that are imposed on the first dollar of production. So if you subtract those out, then you get another figure for the actual amount of income that could be distributed between labor and between profits and labor compensation, and you find an actually firmer result, which is again that over the last 10 to 20 years we've been where we were in the 50s and 60s. Let's see what else I have. Minus production taxes. Okay, what else do we find? All right. Now, I've anticipated this point, but I think it's worth going over it. Rounding up the usual suspects. This is in the New York Times. Economists have offered various explanations for why workers are not doing better: the steady weakening of labor unions, the ability of American companies to find cheaper labor abroad or automate further, piddling productivity growth, and the rise of superstar companies that are extremely efficient with a relatively small labor force. Well, I think I have another quote. Wall Street Journal. Economists cite a number of possible explanations for the change. One is the workers' ability to negotiate wage increases is weakened, union representation has fallen, China's entry, and all the rest of it. Now, again, all of these explanations become absurd once you actually look at a proper measurement of the trend in labor share. They become absurd because if you ask, well, what was happening to labor share when none of these were operating, or when they were operating in reverse, when unions were strong, you find that labor share is doing about as well, if not somewhat better, than it did in the 1950s and 60s. And what else do I have? This is I guess this is my final chart, the glory days of corporate profits. This is the flip side of that anomaly. This is, again, is for non-financial corporations because they're a decent series, a relatively constant series. This is pre-tax profits as a percentage of the actual net value add, the real income of non-financial corporations. Well, notice that the profits were highest in the 50s and 60s, that the profits fell in the 70s and 80s, and we're now risen a bit, but we're now still lower than we were in the 50s and 60s. That's actually the story of corporate profits, because again, you might want to look on the flip side of all this. We began by talking about how labor is shafted because they're not getting their productivity. We talked about how labor is shafted because they're not getting their share, and we should be finding that the corporate profits have gone through the roof as a share of the income of these non-financial corporations, and we don't find that to be the case at all. I'll tell you something else interesting about this chart. We find that corporate profits tended to be low in the high inflation 1970s and early 80s. Corporate profits as a share of income tended to be low, and they were highest in the low inflation 1950s and 60s. But that's another story altogether. I'm finishing early, and if any of you want to ask some questions or make some comments, I'd be grateful. Hopefully, I've walked you through a few of the numbers. What I've tried to show you is that if you have your head screwed on right, you read the Austrians, you try to make sense of the numbers, you talk to people who actually run the numbers, you can find some of the most appalling mistakes that the mainstream will make. And there's another more complicated mistake that's being made with respect to labor share. What you do find is that while there's one lone voice at the Bureau of Economic Analysis that has blown the whistle on all this, it's difficult to contradict the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But this is really just an exercise in economic 101 measurement, which shows that a whole lot of presumably sophisticated economists cannot get it right, and that the zeal with which they pounce, the attitude they take, which is that I guess that government must do something because labor is being shafted, the mistakes that they can make in the process really do somewhat shock you, I trust, because these are fairly elementary mistakes. Any questions?
So do you have any reading recommendations that can direct us or resources on how to interpret certain types of data and aggregate measures? Yeah. Well, I mean, as a matter of fact, the only, as I mentioned to you, the only good titles that I can recommend, I'm going to try to think of some others, but the good titles I can recommend are my book, Econo Spinning, which is still in print, and Bob Murphy's, because Bob Murphy really does a dive into the data, because Krugman covered the data, and Murphy covers them very well also.
I mean, the odd part of it is that if you, as I say in this particular case, I've been quoting from the Bureau of Economic Analysis handbook, you know, I should say the Bureau of Economic Analysis is the agency that's part of the Commerce Department, and they cover the broad aggregate numbers, and they have their own price measure. Then there's the Bureau of Labor Statistics that covers the unemployment rate and then does productivity, and it also issues its CPI. The Bureau of Economic Analysis is a much more sophisticated agency than the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and actually, if you read their handbook, which you'll find online, where they explain the data, the quotes that I gave you, I think were pretty good. Pretty sensible, and so I guess the third thing to recommend is reading the Bureau of Economic Analysis handbook, because it is it does explain the data pretty well. It's got about 7 chapters, and if you go, because most of these data come from Haver Analytics. They've given me a free subscription to their data, and it's very user friendly. But of course, you can get their data, the BEA data on BEA Interactive. They have all their data that's on spreadsheets, and of course, then a lot of people use Fred. So I guess those are 3 titles. Anyway, anybody else? Yeah.
Hi, I was born in 1995, hence I'm largely ignorant of history before then, besides what I've read in books, so I'm largely ignorant.
Did you ever hear World War II? No?
I mean, yes, but I'm largely ignorant of like economics history.
Oh,
so,
okay.
you know, if you read a standard history book, you mostly just...
The Great Depression, have you heard of that?
Yes, I've heard of the Great Depression. Nevertheless, like, I'm ignorant of any charts that correspond to...
Well, yeah, so that's the nice thing. A lot of
those
this, you know, I
events.
was born in 1944, it's true, and this data starts in 1947. I was only 3 years old then. But and I wasn't tracking it then. I was a Stalinist at the time, as you know. But of course, you can now actually, of course, look at history through this data. But go ahead, what was your question?
Yes, my question is, what is your interpretation for the drops in corporate profits from roughly 65 to 70, and then slightly after 95 to slightly after 2000?
Yes, good question. Yeah, I guess I'm not to finesse most of your excellent question. The only thing I have noticed again is that the profits were low during the high inflation years. But you're asking me about 95 and 2000. Why they've risen a bit? I really don't know enough about it. The only thing I can say is that what's interesting to me, I post this a lot on Twitter because. All the left wing, Robert Reich, for example, has got 1.5 million followers on Twitter, and he says profits are at a 75-year high, and I'm just posting pre-tax profits as a percentage of the net income of these non-financial corporations. They're not at any kind of 75-year high. Profits are actually recently not even that much higher than they were about 10, 15 years ago. But again, my lame answer to your question is only to say that what's interesting to me is that high price inflation is not good for corporate profits. The high inflation years were the 1970s and early 80s. And you can see the corporate profits fell. The low inflation seems to be better. And so I believe that what's going to happen, that even this slight bump up is probably not going to last. And that really what seems to happen, certainly happened then and seems to happen, will happen probably in the future, is that obviously price inflation also affects costs, and the costs start to bite, and I think that probably is going to happen. The preliminary data indicates seemingly the third quarter profits. This just takes you through the. Second quarter. This takes you through the first quarter of 2022, just the first quarter, and it blipped down a little bit. It's probably going to blip down even further. They have to pay for oil, they have to pay for their labor, they've got to pay for higher debt costs, so it puts them in a squeeze. It may have been higher debt, but so I'm only answering a small part of your question, and now that you know this history, I invite you to answer the next part of your question and write me an email with your answer. What happened in the 90s? Yeah. Well, you want to say that in the micro, the dot-com? Yeah, yes.
I imagine the second drop.
Oh, yeah,
that
well,
he knows
you mean,
would be the
you mean,
dot-com bubble.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about, in 01, that period. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I probably should have put in some recession bars because you're right. Yeah. During recessions, of course, profits really suffer. The profits are much more volatile than wages. Capital investment is much more volatile, and indeed, so you have helped me out with that. Thank you very much. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Yeah, when it comes to the economists like Robert Reich and Richard Wolff, do you see them as being malicious with the way they present data or as just being ignorant?
Malicious. Well, no, I think, okay, now come on. First of all, why are you generalizing about the two of them? Maybe one is malicious and the other is ignorant. And really, okay, Richard Wolff is both malicious and ignorant. Now, why do you mention? I debated Richard Wolff on socialism, and it's gotten nearly 5.2 million views on YouTube and a commensurate number of podcast downloads. And I owe it all to Richard Wolff, I think. I debated two other socialists, and that got about 100,000 views. But with Richard Wolff, it takes off. I think I'm coattail riding on Richard Wolff. But interestingly enough, a week after our debate, giving you a very long-winded answer. A week after our debate, he delivered a lecture in downtown Manhattan, and for 10 minutes he talked about the debate he'd had with a libertarian. And I have a video of that I post because it was available on video. I post those 10 minutes, and I offer a free lifetime subscription to the SoForum debates for anybody who can verify a single thing that he recalls. A week after the debate, he invented a completely fictitious narrative about what I had said and what he had said. And okay, that could be denial. Maybe that's not viciousness. But I was told. I was told by a guy in the same department, told by a progressive socialist who used to be in the department with Richard Wolff at UMass, that everybody hated him, nobody was talking to him, he's a vicious guy. And so that's the real evidence. But Robert Reich actually, so he's both ignorant and vicious. But Robert Reich really, I've seen him appear, I bridle every time somebody insults him for his height. I think it reflects well on him that he's 4'10", and that he got, and then he got this far as he did in life. I think anybody who talks like that is vicious. And so I would defend this guy completely on that basis. And I've heard him speak. He's a little bit smug. But everything comes out of his butt. He doesn't look anything up. But he's clearly just a sort of like a religious fanatic. He believes that if he thinks it's right, then it must be right. And every once in a while he's quoting an article or something like that. But most of the time he quotes nothing. He cites numbers and quotes nothing. Really, the most baffling thing is that he does have 1.5 million followers, and that people seem to believe what he writes. So I probably should get over the habit of running a chart that contradicts what he just said. I do that a lot on Twitter, just to show that these are the actual numbers. But so then to sum up my long-winded response, Robert Reich is ignorant. He's a kind of a true believer. I'm reading the book The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, and Jonathan Haidt makes the argument, and I know Michael Malice highly recommended that book, and Jonathan Haidt basically talks about how we have the mind. We're like a person on an elephant. We've got a mind, but really the elephant is telling us what to think. All of our intuitions and all of our presumptions, and then we use our mind to rationalize our prejudices, rationalize our assumptions and presumptions. And I want to say to Jonathan Haidt, that's true, except it's not true of libertarians. And the reason why it's not true of libertarians is that we're stuck with a relatively tragic sense of life. We're stuck with it because we know there's nobody on a white horse. There is no government that can cure prejudice. We know that capitalism punishes bigotry. We know that, but we're not going to deny that there still will be bigotry. And that usually if there's a lot of bigotry, it comes primarily from the government, so there's really no solution. We have to reconcile ourselves to a lot of relatively unhappy conclusions. There are happy things that we believe in. We do see that a libertarian world could be a decent society, could be a good world, but it will be a highly imperfect world. There will still be awful things happening in society. Whereas the progressives really think that if we just get government to behave better and act better, then most things can be solved. There won't be any bigotry because they'll pass a law against it. There won't be any shootings because they'll take away all the guns. All of those things. So how did I get into that? Yeah, that's because Robert Reich is really like that person in Jonathan Haidt's book, and I guess the followers are like that person as well. Our only hope is that maybe if you use your mind, you can cope with the world a little bit better and recognize that libertarianism and the free market is the only answer. And then, as I emphasized today, that the happy fact is that capitalism not only brings freedom, it brings prosperity. And then every once in a while when I get excited, I say, my God, maybe that's a good reason to believe in God. Maybe capitalism would bring liberty, freedom, and not prosperity. Then what would we do? It would be kind of a dilemma. But it brings both. Now, that I believe can be empirically and conceptually justified, and that's a relatively happy conclusion. And hopefully, if we preach this to the followers of Robert Reich, I don't expect him to learn anything at this point, but preach that to his followers, maybe some of them will listen, and that's my long-winded answer to your question. And are there any other questions? We've got about 5 minutes to go. Yeah, I guess. No. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you much.